Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Adirondack High Peaks region, near the abandoned mining settlement of Tahawus, New York, in October of last year. I should have known something was wrong the moment David suggested we camp at the old ironworks ruins. David Jones had been my best friend since college, a pragmatic accountant who preferred his adventures from the safety of documentaries and hiking guides. The fact that he wanted to venture into one of the most isolated corners of the Adirondacks, miles from any marked trail, should have been my first warning. "Come on, Mike," he'd said, spreading topographical maps across my kitchen table 3 weeks earlier. "When's the last time we did something that actually mattered? Something real?" His finger traced a route through unmarked wilderness, past abandoned settlements and forgotten mining claims. "Look at this place. Tahawus, ghost town from the 1800s. Iron ore mines, old furnaces, the whole works. It's like stepping back in time." I studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he held his coffee. David had been different since his divorce finalized 6 months ago. Quieter, more withdrawn. His ex-wife Sarah had taken everything: the house, the dog, half his savings. Maybe he needed this. Maybe we both did. "All right," I said. "But we do this right. Proper gear, emergency beacon, the works." The drive up Route 28N toward Newcomb took us through increasingly desolate country. Fall colors blazed around us: crimson maples, golden birches, the deep amber of dying oak leaves. Beautiful, but there was something oppressive about it too, as if nature was showing off one last time before the long death of winter. We parked at a hunter's access road about 15 miles south of Newcomb, where David's research had indicated an old logging trail that would take us within hiking distance of the Tahawus ruins. The afternoon sun slanted low through the trees as we shouldered our packs and headed into the wilderness. The trail was barely visible, more of an animal track than anything meant for human feet. Fallen logs blocked our path every few hundred yards, forcing us to scramble over or around them. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional call of a crow in the distance. "You sure about these coordinates?" I asked, checking my GPS for the third time in an hour. David nodded, though I noticed he kept glancing at his own device with a frown. "Should be another 2 miles northeast. The old furnace stack is supposed to be visible from pretty far off." But as the afternoon wore on, our electronics began behaving strangely. My GPS would show us heading northeast one moment, then claim we were walking south the next. David's phone died completely despite showing a full charge that morning. The compass on my watch spun lazily, unable to find magnetic north. "Probably the iron ore deposits," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Messes with instruments." We made camp as darkness fell, in a small clearing surrounded by towering white pines. The trees were ancient, some easily over 100 feet tall, their trunks thick enough that 3 men couldn't wrap their arms around them. They created a natural cathedral, their branches so dense overhead that only scattered pinpricks of stars were visible. I built the fire while David set up our tent. The wood was oddly reluctant to catch, requiring far more kindling and patience than it should have. When flames finally took hold, they burned with an unsettling blue-green tinge that I'd never seen before. "Mineral content in the wood," David said when I mentioned it, but I caught him staring at the flames with obvious unease. We ate a simple dinner of trail mix and instant soup, talking quietly about work, about David's plans to start over somewhere new. The fire crackled and hissed, occasionally throwing off sparks that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics would allow. "Mike," David said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper, Do you hear that?" I listened. At first, there was only the usual forest night sounds: wind through pine needles, the distant hoot of an owl, the settling of cooling wood. Then I heard it too. A low, rhythmic tapping sound, like someone knocking on wood in a slow, deliberate pattern. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. "Woodpecker," I suggested, though I knew it was far too regular, too purposeful. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. Even the wind had died. "We should get some sleep," David said, but neither of us moved toward the tent. The fire began to die down, and I reached for more wood. As I fed branches into the flames, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There, just at the edge of our firelight's reach, two pale shapes reflected the glow. Eyes. Watching us. "David," I whispered, not daring to look away. "There's something—" When I glanced back, the eyes were gone. "What?" David's hand was already reaching for the hunting knife on his belt. "Nothing. Thought I saw— probably just a deer." But I knew it wasn't a deer. Those eyes had been too high off the ground, too intelligent, too hungry. We retreated to our tent, though sleep came slowly. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the forest around us, hyper-aware of every sound. Sometime after midnight, the tapping started again, closer this time, circling our campsite in a slow, methodical pattern. I must have dozed off because I woke to David shaking my shoulder. Pale dawn light filtered through the tent walls. "Mike," he said urgently, "the fire's out." I sat up, instantly alert. We'd banked the coals carefully before bed. They should have lasted until morning. But when I unzipped the tent flap, I saw only a circle of cold ash where our fire had been. Stranger still, our camp looked different. Not obviously disturbed, but somehow rearranged. My backpack was 3 feet from where I'd left it. David's boots were pointed in the wrong direction. Small things, easily explained, but wrong nonetheless. "Did you get up during the night?" I asked. David shook his head. "Dead sleep. First good rest I've had in weeks." He paused, frowning. "Though I had the strangest dreams. Someone was calling my name from the forest. A woman's voice, but not quite right. Like an echo of an echo." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. We broke camp quickly, eager to find the Tahawus ruins and complete David's mysterious pilgrimage. The day was overcast, with low clouds that seemed to press down on the forest canopy. Our breath misted in the cool air as we followed what David insisted was the correct trail, though I saw no signs we were on any kind of established path. The terrain grew rougher as we climbed, forcing us to scramble over jumbles of moss-covered boulders and fallen trees. The forest itself seemed different from the previous day, darker somehow, despite the daylight. The trees pressed closer together, their branches intertwining overhead until we walked through a perpetual twilight. "How much farther?" I asked, checking my watch. It was just past noon, but the light was so dim it could have been evening. David consulted his compass, a mechanical one that couldn't be affected by electronics failure. But instead of pointing steadily north, the needle spun lazily in circles, never settling on any particular direction. "The iron deposits," he said again, but his voice was strained. We pressed on, driven by a stubborn refusal to admit we were lost. The trail, if it had ever been a trail, disappeared entirely, leaving us to navigate by instinct through dense undergrowth that seemed to grab at our clothes and equipment. It was David who spotted the structure first, pointing through a gap in the trees to where a tall stone chimney rose above the forest floor like a skeletal finger. "There," he said, his voice filled with relief and excitement. "The old furnace stack. We made it." The ruins of Tahawus were more extensive than I'd expected. Besides the main furnace stack, there were foundations of several buildings scattered through a clearing that nature was slowly reclaiming. Rusted iron machinery poked through carpets of fallen leaves, and stone walls emerged from the earth like the ribs of some vast buried skeleton. But there was something wrong with the place. The silence was too complete. No bird songs, no insect sounds, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed reluctant to enter the clearing. "Look at this," David called from beside a partially collapsed stone building. "The craftsmanship is incredible. These walls are 2 feet thick." I joined him, running my hand along the fitted stone blocks. The mortar between them was stained dark, not from age or weather, but with something that looked disturbingly organic. "David," I said slowly, "when exactly did this place shut down?" He consulted a printed page from his research, though I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. According to this, the ironworks closed in 1857, but there were some logging operations here into the 1890s. That's over a century ago, so why do these ruins look so fresh? It was true. Despite being abandoned for more than 100 years, the stonework showed remarkably little weathering. The iron machinery, while rusted, wasn't the corroded slag it should have been after a century of Adirondack winters. "Dry climate," David said, but even he didn't sound convinced. We made camp in the ruins, despite my growing unease. David seemed almost feverishly excited to be there, photographing everything with an old film camera he'd brought along. The digital camera in his pack had suffered the same mysterious fate as our other electronics, completely dead despite a full charge. As evening approached, we built our fire in what had once been the hearth of the main building. The stones around it were stained black with old soot, but also with something else, dark stains that had seeped deep into the rock. "The workers here," David said as we ate dinner, "they had a hard life. Brutal winters, dangerous work, isolated from civilization for months at a time." He stared into the flames, which once again burned with that unsettling blue-green tinge. Some of them never left. Disease, accidents, madness from the isolation. "Cheerful," I muttered, but something in David's tone made me look at him more closely. His eyes reflected the firelight with an odd intensity, and I realized he hadn't blinked in several long moments. "The local Abenaki tribe had stories about this place," he continued in the same flat, measured tone. "They called it the Hungry Ground, said something lived here that fed on human flesh and despair. They wouldn't come within miles of these mountains." "David," my voice was sharp with concern, "where exactly did you get all this information? You never mentioned any of this before." He turned to look at me, and for a split second I didn't recognize the face staring back. The features were David's, but the expression was utterly alien, calculating, predatory, ancient. Then he blinked, and it was just my friend again, looking confused and slightly embarrassed. I'm not sure. Must have read it somewhere." He rubbed his forehead. "I've been having the strangest thoughts all day, like someone else's memories are mixing with mine." That night, I slept poorly despite my exhaustion. The fire died sometime after midnight, plunging us into a darkness so complete it seemed solid. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to David's breathing beside me, but something was wrong with the rhythm. Too slow, too deliberate, like he was consciously controlling each breath. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of our tent zipper opening. I sat up, reaching for my flashlight, but David's sleeping bag was empty. "David," I whispered. No response. I scrambled out of the tent, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The ruins looked different at night, larger somehow, more labyrinthine. Shadows seemed to move just beyond my light's reach, and the stone walls appeared to pulse like living tissue. "David!" I called louder, my voice echoing strangely among the ruins. From somewhere in the darkness came an answering call. "Mike, help me." The voice was David's, but wrong somehow. Distorted, like it was being stretched through something that didn't quite understand human speech. I followed the sound deeper into the ruins, my flashlight beam dancing over crumbling walls and rusted machinery. The voice called again, leading me toward the old furnace stack. As I approached, I saw a dark opening at its base, a feeding port for the original fire. "Mike, I'm hurt. Can't move." The voice was coming from inside the furnace. I knelt at the opening, shining my light into the interior. The space was larger than it should have been, extending back into the earth in a tunnel that my beam couldn't penetrate. And there, about 20 feet back, something pale reflected my light. "David, is that you?" "Come closer. Can't reach." Every instinct I had screamed danger, but that was my best friend's voice, scared and hurt and calling for help. I crawled partway into the tunnel, my flashlight held ahead of me. The pale object wasn't David. It was a skull, picked clean and polished white. Human. And around it, scattered in the dirt, were more bones. Dozens of them. Some old and yellowed, others disturbingly fresh. I scrambled backward, my heart hammering, and that's when I heard the laughter. Low and buzzing, like the sound of flies over carrion. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere. The walls, the ground, the air itself. I ran back to our campsite, my flashlight beam wild and unfocused. The tent was empty, David's sleeping bag tossed aside as if he'd left in a hurry, or been dragged. "David!" I screamed into the darkness. The echo came back wrong, twisted into something that sounded like mocking laughter. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the cold remains of our fire, clutching my hunting knife and jumping at every sound. When dawn finally came, gray and reluctant through the clouds, I found David sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing. "There you are," he said with a smile. "I was wondering where you'd gotten to." Relief flooded through me. "Jesus Christ, David, where were you? I've been looking for you all night." He cocked his head, still smiling that strange smile. "All night? I just went to gather some firewood. Couldn't have been gone more than 20 minutes. But his clothes were filthy, streaked with dirt and something darker. And his eyes were wrong. Too bright, too knowing, like he was looking at me from some vast distance. "David, it's morning. You've been gone for hours." His smile never wavered. "That's silly, Mike. It's not morning. Look around. It's barely getting dark." I stared at him, then at the sky. It was definitely dawn. I could see the gradual lightening in the east, hear the first tentative bird calls, but David seemed genuinely convinced it was evening. "We should get going," I said carefully. "Pack up camp, head back to the car." "But we just got here," David protested. "I want to explore more. There are caves in the furnace stack, Mike. Deep ones. I think they connect to old mine shafts. We could spend days mapping them." The thought of going anywhere near that furnace again made my skin crawl. "David, something's wrong with this place. Our equipment keeps failing, the fire burns the wrong color, and you were missing for—" "I wasn't missing," he interrupted, and for a moment his voice dropped to a growl that made my blood freeze. Then he was back to normal, looking confused and slightly hurt. "I'm fine, Mike. Never been better, actually. I feel clear, like I've been living in a fog my whole life and it's finally lifting." I packed my gear as quickly as possible, hoping David would follow my lead, but he seemed content to sit on his log, watching me with that unnerving smile. When I shouldered my pack and started toward what I hoped was the trail out, he finally stood to follow. "This way," he said, pointing in the opposite direction from where I was heading. "The car's this way, David." I checked my compass, though I knew it was useless. "No, it's not." His voice was patient, like he was explaining something to a child. "Trust me." For a moment, I wavered. David knew these mountains better than I did. His research had been exhaustive, but every instinct I had told me he was wrong. More than wrong. Lying. "I'm going this way," I said firmly. "You can come with me or not." His smile faded, and for a split second, I saw something else in his face. Something hungry and calculating and utterly inhuman. Then it was gone, and he was just David again, looking hurt and confused. "Okay," he said. your call." We walked in silence through the forest, but it was the wrong kind of silence. David's footsteps made no sound on the fallen leaves. When I glanced back at him, I saw no breath misting in the cold air, and his shadow. His shadow fell in the wrong direction, as if cast by a light source that didn't exist. The trail seemed to shift around us. Paths appeared and disappeared, landmarks repeated themselves, and the sun, when it was visible through the canopy, seemed to move in impossible directions. We walked for hours, but the trees never thinned. The terrain never looked familiar. "We're lost," I said finally. David nodded cheerfully. "I know." "You know? What do you mean you know?" "I mean we're exactly where we're supposed to be, Mike. This place, it's been calling to me for months, ever since Sarah left. Every night I'd dream about it. The ruins, the forest, the hunger. I needed to come here. I needed to bring you." My mouth went dry. "Bring me? David, what are you talking about?" He stopped walking and turned to face me fully. In the filtered light of the forest, his skin looked waxy and pale, stretched too tight over his bones. When he smiled, his teeth seemed sharper than they should be. "It's been so long since I've had a proper meal," he said in a voice that was no longer David's. "So very, very long." I dropped my pack and ran. Behind me, something that had once been my best friend began to laugh. A sound like wind through a graveyard, like the last breath of dying men. But underneath the laughter was another sound, worse somehow. The crack and pop of bones elongating, of flesh reshaping itself into something never meant to walk on two legs. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes and face. The thing behind me was faster. I could hear it gaining, moving through the forest with inhuman speed and grace. But it was playing with me, I realized. It could have caught me already if it wanted to. It wanted me to run. It was savoring my terror. The forest around me began to change as I fled. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches reaching down like gnarled fingers. The ground beneath my feet became soft and spongy, giving off a sweet, rotten smell with each step. And the sky. The sky was darkening, though I couldn't tell if it was from clouds or something else. I stumbled into another clearing and saw them. Dozens of wooden posts driven into the ground, each topped with something that gleamed white in the dim light. Skulls. Human skulls, all facing inward toward the center of the clearing where a massive shape hunched in the shadows. The thing that had been David emerged from the tree line behind me, but it had completed its transformation. 9 feet tall, with limbs like twisted branches and fingers that ended in yellowed claws. Its skin was mottled gray-green, stretched tight over too many bones. But worst of all was its face, still recognizably David's features, but elongated and warped, with eyes like holes into an endless winter and a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth. "Look around you, Mike," it said in David's voice, though the mouth moved wrong, like it was speaking with someone else's vocal cords. "Look at my collection. Hikers, hunters, campers who wandered too far from the marked trails. They all thought they were so prepared, so careful, but the mountains are hungry, and they've been feeding me for over a century." "You're not David," I whispered. "No," it agreed. "David Jones died the moment he stepped into this clearing. I've been wearing him like a suit, learning his memories, his mannerisms, his friendship with you. Did you know he was planning to kill himself, Mike? Standing on the edge of that bridge in Albany, ready to jump. I saved him from that fate, gave his death meaning." The creature began to circle me, moving with a predator's grace. "The hunger is so much worse than the cold, Mike. So much worse than the loneliness. But your flesh will sustain me through another winter. Your bones will join my collection. And maybe, if you're lucky, a little piece of you will survive in my memories." I still had my hunting knife, for all the good it would do against something like this. But as the Wendigo closed in, teeth glistening in the gloom, I heard something that made both of us freeze. The distant sound of helicopter blades. Search and rescue. Someone had noticed we were overdue and sent help. The Wendigo's head snapped toward the sound, and for the first time, I saw fear in those black eyes. It snarled, a sound like a bear trap snapping shut, and lunged toward me with claws extended. I dove to the side, rolling behind one of the skull posts. The Wendigo's claws shattered the wood like kindling, sending the skull flying into the darkness. But the distraction gave me the opening I needed. As it turned to follow me, I drove my knife into what I hoped was its knee. Black blood spurted and the creature howled in pain and rage. But instead of collapsing, it grabbed my wrist and lifted me off the ground like I weighed nothing. "You think steel can harm me?" it laughed. "I am the hunger that walks, the winter that never ends. I am." The helicopter was closer now, and through the canopy I could see searchlights sweeping the forest. The Wendigo heard it too, and its grip on my wrist loosened slightly. That's when I saw it. Lying in the dirt beside one of the posts was an old iron spike, probably from the mining equipment at Tahawus. Without thinking, I grabbed it and drove it up into the creature's throat. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Wendigo dropped me, staggering backward as black blood poured from the wound. Where the iron touched its flesh, the skin began to burn and bubble, filling the air with the stench of sulfur and decay. "Iron," it gasped, clawing at its throat. "Cold iron. How did you—" But it was too late. The creature collapsed, its body already beginning to dissolve into something that looked like old leaves and shadow. Within moments, there was nothing left but a pile of rotting organic matter and David's empty clothes. The helicopter found me 3 hours later, standing in an ordinary forest clearing with no sign of the horrors I'd witnessed. The skull posts were gone, the Wendigo's remains had vanished, and even the Tahawus ruins were nowhere to be found, just dense wilderness stretching in every direction. They told me I was suffering from exposure and dehydration, that I'd been wandering in circles for 2 days. David Jones, they said, was still missing. His body never found despite extensive searches. The official report listed him as lost in the wilderness, probably fallen into one of the many deep ravines that scarred the Adirondack backcountry. I never told them the truth. Who would believe it? But sometimes, on particularly cold nights, I still hear David's voice calling to me from the darkness, and I wonder if somewhere in those ancient mountains, something else is wearing his face, learning to be human again, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting hikers to venture too far from the marked trails. The hunger that walks is patient. It has all the time in the world, and it's always looking for new friends to bring to dinner. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness surrounding Cranberry Lake in the Adirondack Mountains of New York during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip with my co-workers. I should have known something was wrong the moment we crossed the bridge over the Oswegatchie River. The water beneath us was black as tar, reflecting nothing. Not the sky, not the trees, not even our headlights as we drove across in the gathering dusk. But I was too caught up in the excitement of finally getting away from the suffocating cubicle walls of our insurance office in Albany to pay attention to such details. There were 4 of us making the trip. Myself, along with Jessica Davis, Brian Wright, and Jennifer Williams. We'd been planning this getaway for months, ever since our supervisor had finally approved our collective time-off request. The idea was simple enough. Rent a remote campsite near Cranberry Lake, spend 3 days hiking the old-growth forest trails, and return to civilization refreshed and ready to tackle another soul-crushing quarter of claims processing. Jessica, our self-appointed trip coordinator, had done extensive research on the area. She'd found us a primitive camping spot about 8 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a narrow dirt track that wound through dense stands of ancient hemlocks and sugar maples. The isolation was exactly what we wanted. No cell towers, no Wi-Fi, no constant ping of email notifications. Just us, the wilderness, and the kind of profound silence that city dwellers like ourselves rarely experienced. Brian, ever the practical joker of our office, had spent weeks leading up to the trip regaling us with increasingly outlandish stories about the Adirondacks. Bigfoot sightings, mysterious disappearances, Native American legends about cannibalistic spirits that roamed the deep woods. Jennifer and I mostly laughed these off as Brian being Brian, but Jessica seemed genuinely unsettled by some of the tales, particularly the ones about something called a Wendigo, a creature from Ojibwe folklore that was said to inhabit the northern forests, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. "It's just stories," I'd assured her during one particularly graphic retelling. "The only thing we need to worry about are black bears, and even they're more afraid of us than we are of them." How wrong I was. We reached our campsite just as the last traces of daylight were fading from the western sky. The clearing was smaller than it had appeared in the photos Jessica had shown us, perhaps 30 feet across, surrounded on all sides by towering trees whose canopy blocked out most of the star-filled sky above. A stone fire ring sat in the center, blackened by countless previous campfires, with a weathered picnic table nearby. The silence was immediate and oppressive. After living in Albany for 6 years, I'd grown accustomed to the constant background hum of urban life, traffic, air conditioners, distant conversations. Here, the quiet was so complete, it seemed to press against my eardrums like a physical weight. Even our voices seemed muted, absorbed by the dense forest around us. We set up our tents in a rough semicircle around the fire pit, Jessica and Jennifer sharing a larger 2-person tent, while Brian and I each claimed our own. The process took longer than expected in the fading light, and by the time we had everything secured, full darkness had settled over the forest like a heavy blanket. Brian got the fire started while Jessica prepared our dinner, prepackaged camping meals that, while not exactly gourmet, would serve our purposes well enough. The flames cast dancing shadows against the tree trunks, creating the illusion of movement just beyond the reach of the light. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd seen something shifting in the darkness, only to find empty forest. "You seem jumpy," Jennifer observed, settling beside me on one of the logs we'd dragged over to serve as seating. Her voice carried a note of concern that I appreciated, though I was reluctant to admit my unease. "Just adjusting to the silence," I replied, accepting a steaming bowl of beef stew from Jessica. "It's different out here." "That's the point," Brian said, stabbing at the fire with a long stick and sending sparks spiraling up into the night. "No deadlines, no office politics, no Mrs. Henderson calling every day to complain about her claimed status. Just us and nature." He gestured grandly toward the dark forest surrounding us, and for a moment, a trick of the firelight made his shadow seem impossibly tall and distorted against the trees behind him. I blinked, and the shadow returned to normal proportions, but the image lingered in my mind like an afterburn. We spent the next hour sharing stories and jokes, the comfortable camaraderie of coworkers who'd genuinely grown to like each other over the past few years. Jessica told us about her childhood camping trips with her grandfather in the Catskills. Jennifer shared embarrassing stories from her college hiking club. Brian, predictably, regaled us with more tales of wilderness horror, though these seemed somewhat more restrained than his usual office performances. It was Jessica who first noticed something was wrong with the fire. "That's odd," she said, frowning at the flames. We all turned to look, and I felt my stomach clench with unease. The fire, which had been burning a normal orange-red color just moments before, now flickered with occasional flashes of blue and green. The flames themselves seemed to move wrong, flowing upward in patterns that defied the gentle breeze stirring the forest around us. "Must be something in the wood," Brian said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Different minerals in the soil up here, maybe." Jennifer stood and walked closer to the fire ring, studying the flames intently. "I've never seen anything like this before," she said softly. "It's almost like—" She stopped mid-sentence, her head tilting to one side as if listening to something. The rest of us fell silent, straining to hear whatever had caught her attention. For a long moment, there was nothing but the usual forest sounds: the soft whisper of wind through leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the subtle creaking of tree branches. Then we heard it, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a low humming that vibrated just at the edge of hearing. It wasn't quite musical, but it had a rhythm to it, like a chant or prayer spoken in a language none of us recognized. The sound seemed to circle our campsite, moving through the trees in a slow, deliberate pattern that made the hair on my arms stand on end. "What the hell is that?" Brian whispered, and for the first time since I'd known him, he sounded genuinely frightened. The humming continued for perhaps 30 seconds before fading away, leaving us sitting in stunned silence around our strangely colored fire. I found myself gripping the edge of the log so tightly my knuckles had gone white. "Probably just whined through the trees," Jessica said, but her voice shook slightly. "Sound carries differently in the mountains." None of us quite believed her explanation, but we were all desperate enough for normalcy that we pretended to accept it. We finished our dinner in relative quiet, the easy conversation of earlier replaced by nervous glances and forced smiles. When Jennifer suggested we turn in early for the night, no one objected. I lay in my sleeping bag for what felt like hours, listening to the forest around me. The oppressive silence had returned, broken only by the occasional rustle of fabric as one of my companions shifted in their sleep. My small tent felt simultaneously claustrophobic and inadequately protective, its thin nylon walls offering no real barrier against whatever might be lurking in the darkness beyond. I must have eventually dozed off, because I was awakened by the sound of someone unzipping a tent. Checking my watch, I saw it was just past 3 a.m. I lay still, listening as footsteps moved around our campsite. They seemed to pause at each tent in turn, lingering for several seconds before moving on. When they stopped outside my own tent, I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. "Michael?" It was Brian's voice, but something about it sounded off. The usual warmth and humor were gone, replaced by a flat, emotionless tone that made my skin crawl. "Michael, are you awake?" I considered answering, but some primal instinct warned me to remain silent. After a few more seconds, the footsteps moved away, circling our camp once more before finally stopping. I heard the soft whisper of a tent zipper, then silence. In the morning, I asked Brian about his midnight wandering, but he claimed to have slept soundly through the night. When I pressed him about it, he looked at me with genuine confusion, insisting that he hadn't left his tent until dawn. The others confirmed they'd heard nothing unusual, leaving me to wonder if the entire incident had been a vivid dream brought on by the stress of adjusting to our remote location. We spent the morning hiking the Bear Mountain Trail, a moderate 5-mile loop that wound through some of the most beautiful old-growth forest I'd ever seen. Massive hemlocks and white pines towered hundreds of feet above us, their trunks so wide that it would have taken 3 people holding hands to encircle them. The forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen needles, creating a soft, springy surface that muffled our footsteps. For a while, the hiking restored my spirits. The natural beauty of the place was undeniable, and the physical exertion helped work off some of the nervous energy that had been building since our arrival. Jessica proved to be an excellent naturalist, pointing out various bird species and identifying the different types of trees we passed. Jennifer discovered a small waterfall about halfway through the hike, and we stopped for lunch beside the crystal-clear pool at its base. It was Brian who first mentioned the feeling that we were being watched. "Is it just me?" he said, pausing to take a drink from his water bottle. "Or does it feel like something's following us?" I'd been having the same sensation for the past hour, a persistent feeling that unseen eyes were tracking our movement through the forest. Several times I'd spun around, certain I'd glimpsed a figure moving between the trees, only to find empty woodland behind us. "It's natural to feel that way in unfamiliar territory," Jessica said, but I noticed she kept glancing nervously over her shoulder as we resumed hiking. Our brains are wired to be hypervigilant in new environments. Despite her rational explanation, the feeling of being observed only intensified as we made our way back toward camp. By the time we reached our clearing, all 4 of us were visibly on edge, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. That's when we discovered the first sign that something was seriously wrong. Our carefully organized campsite had been disturbed. Not destroyed or ransacked, but subtly altered in ways that immediately set off alarm bells. The picnic table, which we'd left positioned beside the fire ring, had been moved several feet to the left. Our food cache, suspended from a tree branch to keep it safe from bears, hung at a different height than we'd left it. Most unsettling of all, someone, or something, had arranged our camp chairs in a perfect circle around the cold fire pit, all facing inward as if holding some kind of meeting. "Did any of you—" I started to ask, but Jessica cut me off with a sharp shake of her head. "No one did this," she said, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Someone else was here." We spent the next hour checking our belongings, but nothing appeared to be missing. Whoever had visited our camp seemed more interested in making their presence known than in theft. The realization that we weren't alone in this remote wilderness sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling afternoon air. Brian suggested we pack up and leave immediately, but Jessica argued that we were probably dealing with nothing more than local teenagers playing pranks on campers. Jennifer remained silent, but I could see the conflict playing out across her face. The desire to flee, warring with embarrassment at the thought of cutting our trip short over what might be harmless mischief. In the end, we decided to stay, but to take precautions. We moved our tents closer together and agreed to take turns keeping watch throughout the night. I volunteered for the first shift, from 10 p.m. to midnight, followed by Jessica, then Brian, then Jennifer. It seemed like a reasonable plan, and having something concrete to do helped ease some of our collective anxiety. Darkness fell earlier than expected, the thick canopy above us blocking out the last rays of sunlight well before sunset. We got our fire going again, and the flames once more displayed that disturbing blue-green coloration that none of us could adequately explain. The strange humming sound returned as well, circling our camp just as it had the night before, but this time it seemed louder, more insistent. "There," Jennifer said suddenly, pointing toward the tree line. "Did you see that?" I followed her gaze but saw nothing except dark forest. "What was it?" "A figure," she whispered, "standing between those two big pines. It was there for just a second, then it was gone." We all stared at the spot she'd indicated, but if someone, or something, had been there, it had vanished completely. The shadows beneath the trees seemed to shift and flow in the firelight, creating the illusion of movement everywhere I looked. My watch began at 10 p.m. sharp. The others retired to their tents, leaving me alone beside the dying fire with nothing but a flashlight and a growing sense of dread for company. I'd brought a book to help pass the time, but found myself unable to concentrate on the words. Every sound from the forest around me, every creaking branch, every rustling leaf, seemed to herald the approach of some unseen threat. At 11:17 p.m., according to my watch, Jennifer's tent began to glow. It started as just a faint luminescence, barely visible in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look directly at it, the glow seemed to intensify, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. The light appeared to come from within the tent itself, as if Jennifer had somehow become a source of illumination. I stood and moved closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Jennifer," I called softly, "are you okay in there?" No response. The glow continued to pulse, growing brighter with each cycle until I could clearly see Jennifer's silhouette through the tent fabric. But something was wrong with the shadow she cast. It seemed too tall, too angular, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. "Jennifer," I called again, louder this time. The glow vanished instantly, plunging the tent back into darkness. I heard the soft whisper of a sleeping bag zipper, then Jennifer's voice, thick with sleep. "What's wrong? Is it my turn already?" I checked my watch again. 10:23 p.m. 6 minutes had passed, though it felt like much longer. "No, you've got another hour and a half," I told her, trying to keep my voice steady. "I thought I saw a light in your tent." "Must have been my phone," she replied, though I was certain I'd seen her turn it off before climbing into her sleeping bag. "The battery's dying anyway. Go back to your watch." I returned to my position by the fire, but sleep was now the furthest thing from my mind. For the remainder of my shift, I found myself constantly glancing toward Jennifer's tent, waiting for the strange glow to return. It never did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed during those 6 minutes of lost time. Jessica took over at midnight, and I gratefully crawled into my own tent. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. I lay listening to the subtle sounds of Jessica moving around the campsite, the soft scrape of her boots on the ground, the occasional creak of the picnic table as she sat down, the gentle rustle of pages as she read her book. Sometime around 1 a.m., the sounds stopped. I waited for several minutes, assuming Jessica had simply decided to sit quietly and listen to the forest. But as time stretched on with no noise from outside my tent, I began to worry. My watch showed 1:23 a.m. when I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent flap and peer out. The campsite was empty. Our fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to reveal that Jessica was nowhere to be seen. Her book lay open on the picnic table, a flashlight beside it still shining upward into the canopy above. Everything else appeared normal, but Jessica herself had simply vanished. I crawled out of my tent and stood in the center of our camp, calling her name in a harsh whisper. No response came from the dark forest around me. I moved to Brian and Jennifer's tents, shaking them both awake. "Jessica's gone," I told them as they emerged, bleary-eyed and confused. "She was here an hour ago, but now she's just gone." We spent the next 30 minutes searching the immediate area around our campsite, calling Jessica's name and sweeping our flashlight beams through the trees. We found no trace of her, no footprints leading away from camp, no signs of a struggle, no indication of where she might have gone or why. "Maybe she went to relieve herself," Jennifer suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Got disoriented in the dark and couldn't find her way back." "Without her flashlight?" Brian pointed to where Jessica's light still sat on the picnic table. "And why wouldn't she answer when we called?" We agreed to expand our search, splitting up to cover more ground despite every instinct screaming that we should stay together. I took the trail we'd hiked earlier, Jennifer headed toward the lake, and Brian began working his way around the perimeter of our camp in an ever-widening spiral. I'd gone perhaps a quarter mile down the trail when I heard Jennifer scream. The sound cut through the forest like a knife, high and sharp and filled with absolute terror. I spun around and ran back toward camp, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I crashed through the underbrush. Brian's light was already moving in the same direction, and we reached Jennifer's position at almost the same moment. She stood at the edge of our campsite, her flashlight trained on something just inside the tree line. Following the beam, I saw what had terrified her. Jessica hung suspended between two large pine trees, about 8 feet off the ground. Her arms were spread wide, and at first glance it looked like she'd been crucified against the trunks. But as my eyes adjusted to the sight, I realized that no ropes or nails held her in place. She simply hung there, defying gravity, her body swaying gently in the night breeze. Her eyes were open, staring down at us with an expression of such malevolent intelligence that my knees nearly buckled. This wasn't the Jessica I knew, the kind, practical woman who'd organized our trip and identified birds along the hiking trail. This thing wearing Jessica's face smiled at us with too many teeth, its neck twisted at an angle that should have been impossible for a living person. "Hello," it said in Jessica's voice, but the words seemed to come from somewhere else entirely, echoing strangely in the forest air. "Did you miss me?" Brian made a choking sound and stumbled backward, nearly dropping his flashlight. Jennifer began to hyperventilate, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I found myself frozen in place, unable to look away from the horrible thing that had once been our friend. "Come closer," the Jessica thing continued, its impossible smile growing wider. "I have so much to tell you about what I've seen, about what's coming for you." The sound that emerged from its throat then wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite screaming. It was something altogether more horrible, a noise that spoke of hunger and madness and an intelligence so alien that my mind recoiled from trying to comprehend it. That's when Brian broke. He turned and ran into the forest, crashing through the underbrush like a panicked animal. His flashlight beam danced crazily between the trees before disappearing entirely, leaving Jennifer and me alone with the thing that wore Jessica's face. "Now, there are 3, it said, tilting its head to study us with predatory intensity. But soon there will be 2, then 1, then none. I grabbed Jennifer's arm and pulled her away from the tree line, back toward the relative safety of our camp. The fire had died down to barely glowing coals, but I frantically began feeding it twigs and leaves, desperate for more light. Jennifer sat heavily on one of the logs, rocking back and forth and mumbling something under her breath that might have been a prayer. Behind us, the Jessica thing continued to speak, its voice carrying clearly through the night air despite the distance. "He's running deeper into the forest," it said, and I knew it was talking about Brian. "Running toward the old places where the hunger lives. He won't last long out there. The cold will take him first, or maybe the things that hunt in the spaces between the trees. Either way, he'll come back to us eventually. They always come back." I managed to get the fire blazing again, the flames casting our camp in orange light that seemed almost normal after the strange blue-green coloration of the previous nights. The warmth felt good against my skin, but it did nothing to ease the chill that had settled deep in my bones. "What do we do?" Jennifer whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "What the hell do we do, Michael?" I wished I had an answer for her. Everything I thought I knew about the world had been shattered in the space of a few minutes. Whatever was happening to us, it was beyond anything I'd ever imagined possible. "We survive," I told her, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "We stick together, and we survive until dawn. Then we get out of here." From the trees behind us came the sound of something large moving through the forest. Not the measured footsteps of a human, but something that moved with an unnatural, flowing gait that seemed to cover ground impossibly quickly. Jennifer whimpered and pressed closer to the fire. "It's coming," she breathed. "Oh God, it's coming." The sounds grew closer, accompanied now by what might have been singing, a low, wordless melody that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in my bones. The temperature around our camp began to drop, our breath visible in the sudden cold despite the warmth radiating from the fire. That's when I saw the footprints. They appeared in the dirt around our campsite as we watched, pressed into the earth by invisible feet, human-shaped, but wrong in subtle ways. Too long, with what looked like claw marks at the ends of the toes. The prints circled our fire in a slow spiral, growing closer with each revolution. "Do you see them?" I asked Jennifer, needing confirmation that I hadn't completely lost my mind. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "What's making them?" Before I could answer, Brian emerged from the tree line. He walked with the same flowing gait we'd heard moving through the forest, his feet making no sound as they touched the ground. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face streaked with mud and what looked like dried blood. But it was his eyes that made my stomach clench with fear. They reflected the firelight like an animal's, showing no trace of human intelligence. "I found them," he said, his voice as flat and emotionless as Jessica's had been the night before. "The old ones. They've been waiting for us." He stopped just at the edge of our firelight, swaying slightly as if caught in a breeze I couldn't feel. When he smiled, I saw that his teeth had been filed to points. "They're so hungry," he continued, taking a step closer to our fire. "They've been hungry for so long, but you're going to help with that, aren't you? You're going to make the hunger stop." Jennifer scrambled to her feet and moved to stand behind me, using my body as a shield between herself and whatever Brian had become. I could feel her trembling against my back, her breath warm against my neck. "That's not Brian," she whispered. "That's not him anymore." She was right. Looking at the thing wearing my coworker's face, I could see no trace of the man I'd known for 3 years. This was something else entirely, something that had taken his form and was using it to hunt us. "Where's Jessica?" I demanded, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "What did you do with her?" The Brian thing tilted its head, considering my question with the same predatory intelligence I'd seen in the Jessica thing's eyes. "She's feeding them," it said simply, "giving them strength. Soon you'll understand. Soon you'll want to help too." It reached into its jacket pocket and withdrew something that made my blood turn to ice. Jessica's driver's license, her photo smiling up at me from the small plastic rectangle. But the picture had changed. Instead of Jessica's normal expression, the photo showed her face twisted in a rictus of agony and terror. "She tasted like copper and fear," the Brian thing said, licking its lips with a tongue that was far too long. "You'll taste different. Sweeter maybe, or more bitter. We'll find out soon enough." That's when Jennifer broke and ran. I heard her footsteps pounding away from our camp, heading in the direction of the dirt road we'd driven in on. The smart part of my brain knew she was making the right choice. Staying here meant certain death, and our only hope lay in reaching civilization and getting help. But the primitive part of my mind, the part shaped by millions of years of evolution, screamed that I shouldn't let her face the darkness alone. The Brian thing watched her go with amusement, making no move to pursue. "Let her run," it said with a casual shrug. "The forest is large and she doesn't know the way. She'll wander in circles until exhaustion takes her, then crawl into a hollow log to die. Or maybe she'll find one of the old places where the hunger is strongest. Either way, she won't escape." I backed away from the fire, putting distance between myself and the creature that had once been my friend. My flashlight felt pathetically inadequate in my hands, its beam barely penetrating the wall of darkness that surrounded our camp. "What are you?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The thing that looked like Brian smiled wider, showing rows of filed teeth that gleamed in the firelight. "I am what this place makes of those who stay too long," it said. "What the old hunger turns us into. Your friend Jessica understood in the end. She stopped fighting and let it happen. Much easier that way." It began walking toward me with that same flowing, impossible gait. Each step seemed to cover more ground than it should, and I realized with growing horror that I wouldn't be able to outrun it. "Don't worry," it continued, its voice taking on an almost gentle tone. "The change doesn't hurt much. Just a little cold at first, then a kind of letting go. You'll understand so much more afterward. About the forest, about the hunger, about why we've been waiting so long for someone like you." I turned and ran. The forest closed around me like a living thing, branches catching at my clothes and roots trying to trip me with every step. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I crashed through the underbrush, barely illuminating the ground in front of me. Behind me, I could hear the Brian thing following, but its footsteps seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if it was somehow surrounding me while I fled. I'd gone perhaps 100 yards when I stumbled into a small clearing I didn't remember from our earlier hike. In the center stood a circle of standing stones, each about 6 feet tall and covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. The air here felt different, thicker somehow, and charged with an electric tension that made my skin crawl. This was one of the old places the Brian thing had mentioned, I realized. A site of power that predated human settlement of this region by thousands of years. As I stood there trying to catch my breath, I began to understand just how deep the horror of this place really went. The stones weren't carved with those painful symbols. They were made of them. Fossilized bone and sinew and other things I couldn't identify formed into geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow when I wasn't looking directly at them. At the center of the circle, the ground was stained dark with what I hoped was just mineral deposits but suspected was something far worse. Beautiful, isn't it? I spun around to find the Brian thing standing at the edge of the clearing, no longer making any pretense of being human. Its limbs had elongated, stretching into impossible proportions, and its skin had taken on a gray, mottled appearance. When it moved, I could hear bones creaking and stretching inside its body. This is where it all began, it continued, gesturing toward the stone circle with one impossibly long arm. Where the first hunger was born, back when the world was young and the barriers between places were thin. Your kind built settlements around sites like this, never understanding what they were really doing, never realizing they were feeding something that should have been left to starve. More figures emerged from the tree line, twisted, elongated things that might once have been human but had been changed by prolonged exposure to whatever malevolent force inhabited this place. I saw Jessica among them, her body stretched and distorted like Brian's, her face wearing the same predatory smile. "Join us," she said in a voice like grinding stone. "It's so much easier than fighting, so much more peaceful than running." I found myself taking a step toward the stone circle, drawn by some compulsion I couldn't fully understand. The symbols carved into the stones seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and I could feel something vast and ancient stirring beneath the ground. The hunger the creatures spoke of. I could sense it now, a gnawing emptiness that had waited eons for this moment. That's when I heard Jennifer screaming. The sound cut through the supernatural trance that had been settling over me, snapping me back to full awareness. She was somewhere out there in the forest, alone and terrified, and these things were toying with us like cats with mice. I raised my flashlight and shone it directly into the faces of the creatures surrounding me. They recoiled from the beam, hissing and covering their eyes with clawed hands. The light seemed to cause them genuine pain, and I realized I might have found a weapon. "The barriers weaken with each passing year," the Jessica thing snarled, its voice no longer carrying any resemblance to my former co-worker. "Soon, there will be no need for places like this. The hunger will spread, and your cities will become feeding grounds. You cannot stop what's coming." I swept the flashlight beam across the entire group, forcing them back toward the tree line. As they retreated, the compulsion I'd felt toward the stone circle began to fade, replaced by a clear understanding of what I needed to do. I had to find Jennifer. I had to get us both out of this forest before we became like these things. And somehow, I had to make sure no one else ever came to this place. I ran from the clearing, using my flashlight to carve a path through the darkness. Behind me, I could hear the creatures giving chase, but they seemed reluctant to get too close to the light. I began to understand why our fire had burned with those strange colors. There was something in this place that affected even simple flames, imbuing them with properties that worked against the supernatural forces here. Jennifer's screams guided me through the forest, growing louder as I fought my way through the underbrush. I found her trapped in a ravine about half a mile from our camp, surrounded by more of the elongated creatures. They were toying with her, reaching out with their impossibly long arms to brush against her face and hair while she huddled against the rocky wall. I charged down into the ravine, sweeping my flashlight beam across the assembled monsters. They scattered like roaches, hissing and spitting as they fled back into the darkness. Jennifer collapsed into my arms, sobbing with relief. "I got lost," she gasped between tears. "I tried to find the road, but nothing looked right. The trees kept moving and the path kept changing. Then these things found me and they said they were going to make me like them." I helped her to her feet, keeping my flashlight moving in slow arcs to prevent the creatures from getting too close. They hadn't gone far. I could see their eyes reflecting the light from the shadows beneath the trees, watching and waiting for an opportunity to attack. "We need to get back to camp," I told her. "Get our supplies and find the road. Dawn can't be more than a few hours away." What I didn't tell her was that I suspected Dawn might not help us. These things had been here long before humans walked this continent, and they'd survived everything the world had thrown at them. A little sunlight wasn't going to solve our problem. The journey back to our campsite was a nightmare of wrong turns and dead ends. The forest seemed to actively work against us, with paths that led in circles and landmarks that appeared and disappeared when we weren't looking directly at them. More than once, we found ourselves back at the stone circle, drawn there by some force beyond our understanding. When we finally reached our camp, we found it completely destroyed. Our tents had been shredded, our supplies scattered across the clearing, our vehicle's tires slashed. Someone, or something, had made sure we wouldn't be leaving easily. "What do we do now?" Jennifer asked, her voice small and frightened. I checked my watch, 4:17 a.m. Dawn was still hours away, assuming we lived to see it. Our flashlight batteries wouldn't last much longer, and without transportation we faced an 8-mile hike through hostile territory to reach the nearest road. "We make a torch," I said, gathering pieces of our shredded tent and wrapping them around a broken tent pole. "Keep the light going no matter what," and we start walking. I soaked the makeshift torch in white gas from our camp stove and lit it with one of our emergency matches. The flame burned bright and clean, casting a wide circle of light around us. The creatures that had been watching from the tree line retreated even further, confirming my theory that they were vulnerable to fire. We set out into the forest, following what I hoped was the path back to the main road. Jennifer stayed close beside me, occasionally looking over her shoulder at the things that followed us through the darkness. They kept just at the edge of our light, pacing us like wolves following a wounded deer. The next few hours passed in a blur of terror and exhaustion. We climbed over fallen trees, waded through freezing streams, and navigated around sinkholes that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Twice more we found ourselves at the stone circle, despite our best efforts to avoid it. Each time, the compulsion to join the creatures grew stronger, and each time it became harder to break free. By the time the eastern sky began to show the first faint traces of gray, we were both stumbling with fatigue. My torch had burned down to a small stub, and I'd used most of our remaining fuel keeping it alight. Jennifer had stopped talking entirely, focusing all her energy on putting one foot in front of the other. That's when we saw the road. It appeared through the trees like a miracle, a ribbon of cracked asphalt that represented safety and civilization and escape from the nightmare we'd been living. We stumbled toward it, barely believing it was real, afraid it might vanish like everything else in this cursed forest. The creatures that had been following us stopped at the tree line, unwilling or unable to venture onto the man-made surface. I could see them watching from the shadows, their elongated forms swaying in the morning breeze like diseased trees. "Go," I told Jennifer, pushing her toward the road. "Start walking toward town. Flag down the first car you see." "What about you?" she asked, though she was already moving away from the forest. I looked back at the things that had once been Brian and Jessica, at the malevolent intelligence gleaming in their inhuman eyes. They'd let us escape, I realized. This wasn't a victory. It was a release. They'd gotten what they wanted from us, and now they were done playing. "I'll be right behind you," I lied. I waited until Jennifer had disappeared around a bend in the road before turning back to face the creatures. They stood motionless at the forest's edge, watching me with expressions of patient hunger. "What did you do to us?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. The thing that had been Brian smiled with its filed teeth. "We showed you," it said simply. "We showed you what lies beneath the surface of your safe, ordered world, what waits in the spaces between civilization. Now you carry that knowledge with you, and it will grow like a seed in dark soil." I felt it then, a coldness spreading through my chest, a gnawing emptiness that had nothing to do with hunger or thirst. The thing they'd planted in me during our time in the forest, the awareness of ancient hungers and cosmic indifference that would color every moment of my remaining life. "You'll remember us," the Jessica thing added, its voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "And others will see that remembrance in your eyes. Some will be curious. Some will come looking for what you found here, and will be waiting." I turned and walked away from them, following the road toward what I hoped was safety. Behind me, I could hear them singing, that wordless, bone-deep melody that had haunted our nights in the forest. The sound followed me for miles, even after the trees had disappeared from view. I found Jennifer 3 hours later, sitting in the back of a state police cruiser outside a small diner. She was wrapped in a blanket, giving her statement to a sympathetic officer who clearly thought we'd suffered some kind of shared psychological break. I could see it in his eyes, the polite skepticism, the assumption that stress and isolation had caused us to imagine the horrors we described. The official report, when it was finally filed, attributed our experience to exposure-related hallucinations and acute stress reaction. Brian and Jessica were listed as missing, their bodies never found despite extensive search efforts. The campsite was quarantined for several weeks while investigators looked for evidence of foul play, but nothing concrete was ever discovered. Jennifer and I were both treated for exhaustion and hypothermia, then released with recommendations for psychological counseling. We never spoke about what happened in the forest, not to the police, not to the therapists, not even to each other. What would have been the point? No one would have believed us, and speaking the truth out loud would only have made it more real. But I know what I saw. I know what those things are, and I know they're still out there, waiting in places like Cranberry Lake where the barriers between worlds grow thin. Sometimes, late at night, I can feel them watching me through my apartment windows. Sometimes I hear that wordless singing on the wind. And sometimes, when the loneliness becomes too much to bear, I find myself looking up directions to remote camping areas, telling myself I just want to get back to nature. That's when I know the seed they planted is growing, pushing roots deeper into my soul. I won't go back. I can't let myself become what they want me to become. But the knowledge is there, growing stronger every day, and I know that eventually someone else will find their way to that stone circle in the deep woods. When they do, the things that wear familiar faces will be waiting. The hunger is patient. It can wait forever, and it's always looking for new friends to feed it. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York, near the Canadian border where civilization ends and something ancient still hungers. I should have listened to the warnings. The park ranger at the entry station to the High Peaks Wilderness had given me a look that lasted too long when I told him I was hiking the Northville Placid Trail solo, planning to camp near flowed lands and then push north toward the abandoned settlements near Tahawus. His weathered face had tightened, and he'd asked twice if I was sure I wanted to go alone. "A lot of folks been going missing up that way," he'd said, his voice carrying an edge that made my skin crawl. "Strange things happening. Maybe stick to the more popular trails." But I was stubborn. After Sarah left me 3 months ago, after losing my job at the engineering firm, after watching my life crumble piece by piece, I needed the isolation. I needed to prove to myself that I could still handle something on my own. The wilderness had always been my sanctuary, the one place where the constant anxiety that plagued my daily life would quiet to a whisper. So I'd smiled politely, taken my backcountry permit, and driven the winding roads to the trailhead anyway. The first day had been perfect. September in the Adirondacks is magic. The maples blazing red and orange against the dark green pines, the air crisp enough to bite your lungs, the silence so profound it seemed to have weight. I'd made good time hiking in, my pack loaded with 5 days' worth of supplies, my GPS tracking my progress along the well-marked trail. I set up a camp that first night near Calamity Pond, the water black as oil under the star-drunk sky. The fire crackled cheerfully, casting dancing shadows against the surrounding pines. I'd heated a can of chili, drunk some whiskey from my flask, and felt something like peace settle over me for the first time in months. That should have been my first warning. How quickly that peace curdled into unease as full darkness fell. The forest had gone too quiet. No owls hooting, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no splash of fish jumping in the pond, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I'd chalked it up to being out of practice with wilderness camping and forced myself to sleep. The second day started wrong. I woke to find my campfire stone cold, which shouldn't have been possible. I'd banked it carefully with coals that should have lasted until morning. More disturbing, the circle of stones around the fire pit had been rearranged into a perfect spiral pattern that I definitely hadn't made. My phone was dead despite being fully charged the night before. My GPS unit showed my location as a series of error messages and scrambled coordinates. When I pulled out my paper map and compass as backup, the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle on magnetic north. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe there was some kind of magnetic anomaly in the area, or solar flare activity affecting electronics. The fire? Well, maybe I'd just remembered wrong about how I'd left it, but my hands shook as I broke camp and continued north on the trail. The hiking was harder than it should have been. The trail seemed to shift under my feet, sometimes clearly marked, sometimes fading to nothing, forcing me to backtrack repeatedly. Trees I was certain I'd passed before appeared again and again, as if the forest was folding in on itself. By afternoon, I was thoroughly lost despite following what my map claimed was a well-established trail. That's when I found the cabin. It sat in a clearing maybe 50 yards off what I thought was the trail, a small log structure that looked like it had been there for decades. Moss covered half the roof, and the windows were dark, but the place had an oddly preserved quality, as if time moved differently around it. The strangest part was that it wasn't on my map. I checked twice, running my finger along every trail marking, every structure notation. According to the topographical survey, there should have been nothing but dense forest in this area. I approached cautiously, calling out a hello that echoed strangely in the clearing. No answer. The door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight streaming through grimy windows. The place was furnished with handmade furniture that looked like it belonged to another century. A rough-hewn table, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with mason jars filled with unidentifiable preserved things floating in cloudy liquid. On the table, I found a journal. The leather cover was worn smooth, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. The handwriting was spidery, difficult to read, but I made out dates going back to the 1800s. Different hands had written in it over the years, all describing the same thing. October 12th, 1847. It came to the settlement again last night. Took young Timothy from his bed. Found tracks in the morning, but they changed. Started human, but ended something else. Something with too many joints. The elders say we should abandon this place. June 3rd, 1923. The mining company boys don't listen. Told them about the hunger that walks these woods, but they just laugh. Found what was left of their camp this morning. The smell. God help us. The smell. September 15th, 1962. Dr. Morrison from the university came to study the folklore. We tried to warn him. Sometimes on clear nights you can still hear him calling from deep in the woods, but it's not his voice anymore. It's learned to use his voice. August 30th, 1987. The Park Service sealed off the old mining roads, but it doesn't matter. It follows the old paths, the ones that existed before there were trails, before there were names for these mountains, before there were men to give them names. Each entry described the same creature, something that had once been human but had given in to a terrible hunger, transforming into something else. Something that haunted these specific woods, drawn to isolated travelers and those who wandered too far from the safe paths. I should have left the cabin immediately, should have hiked back the way I'd come, regardless of how lost I was. But the sun was already setting, and the idea of navigating the twisted trails in darkness made my stomach clench with fear. I decided to spend the night in the cabin and figure out my route in the morning. That was my second mistake. I built a fire in the stone fireplace using wood from a stack beside the hearth. The flames caught easily, burning with an odd blue-green tinge that I told myself came from copper deposits in the local timber. I heated another can of food and tried to ignore the way the shadows seemed to move independently of the firelight, stretching and contracting like living things. As full darkness fell, the sounds started. First, it was just scratching, like something with claws moving along the outside walls of the cabin. Then came a wet, sliding noise, as if something enormous was dragging itself through the forest just beyond the circle of light cast by my fire. Then I heard the voice. "Kenneth." My blood turned to ice water. It was my voice, calling my own name from somewhere in the darkness outside, but it was wrong, somehow, too stretched, like someone playing a recording at the wrong speed. "Kenneth, why are you hiding from me?" I grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace, my hands slicking with sweat. The voice continued, sometimes from the left side of the cabin, sometimes from the right, sometimes seeming to come from directly above. "I've been so hungry, Kenneth, so very hungry, and you've come such a long way to see me." Through the grimy window, I caught glimpses of movement, something pale and impossibly tall stalking the perimeter of the clearing. Every time I tried to focus on it directly, it seemed to slip back into the shadows, but I could see enough to know it wasn't human. The proportions were all wrong, the limbs too long, the way it moved too fluid and predatory. "I can smell your fear, Kenneth. It makes you smell so much sweeter." The voice was closer now, right outside the door. I heard the soft scrape of claws against wood, then the slow creak of the door handle turning. I pressed my back against the far wall, poker raised, heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The door swung open with a long, theatrical creak, but nothing came through. Just cold air that carried the stench of decay and old meat. "Not yet," the thing wearing my voice whispered. "The hunt is always better when the prey runs first." The door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the windows. I didn't sleep that night. I fed the fire constantly, even though the flames seemed to provide no real warmth, and watched the windows for any sign of movement. Several times I saw faces pressed against the glass, my own face, but twisted into expressions of hunger and malevolent glee that I'd never worn. As dawn finally began to seep through the forest, the sounds faded. The oppressive presence that had surrounded the cabin lifted just enough for me to breathe normally again. I didn't wait for full daylight. I grabbed my pack and stumbled out of the cabin, desperate to find the trail and get as far away from this place as possible. But the clearing where the cabin sat was different in the morning light. The trees around it were wrong, twisted into unnatural shapes, their bark blackened as if by some ancient fire, and the cabin itself looked older, more decrepit, as if decades had passed overnight. Worse, there was no trail. I'd followed a clear path to reach this place, but now there was nothing but dense forest in every direction. It was as if the trail had never existed at all. I picked a direction and started walking, pushing through undergrowth that seemed to clutch at my clothes and scratch at my exposed skin. The sun was visible through the canopy, but it provided no sense of direction. It seemed to hang in the same position no matter how long I walked, casting shadows that fell in impossible directions. My water was running low by midday, and my food supplies had somehow dwindled to almost nothing despite the fact that I'd barely eaten since yesterday. When I checked my pack more carefully, I found that most of my canned goods had burst open, their contents turned to a foul-smelling black sludge that made me gag. The forest around me was dying. The further I walked, the more apparent it became. The trees grew thin and skeletal, their leaves brown and shriveled despite the fact that it was peak foliage season. The air itself felt thin, difficult to breathe, as if the oxygen was being slowly leached away. By afternoon, I started finding bones. They were human bones, picked clean and white, scattered throughout the undergrowth. Not random remains, but carefully arranged, sometimes in circles, sometimes in lines that pointed deeper into the forest. And they were fresh. Some still had scraps of modern clothing clinging to them, bits of nylon and fleece that could only have come from recent hikers. I tried to turn back, to retrace my steps, but the forest had changed again. The path I'd taken was gone, replaced by a maze of dead trees and thorny undergrowth that seemed designed to funnel me in one direction, deeper into the heart of whatever sick domain I'd stumbled into. That's when I started hearing the other voices. "Help me," came a woman's voice from somewhere to my left. "Please, I'm hurt." I knew it was a trap, but the voice sounded so genuinely distressed that I almost went toward it anyway. Almost. "Over here," called a man's voice from my right. "I found the trail." More voices joined in, dozens of them, all calling out from different directions. Some spoke in English, others in languages I didn't recognize, all of them pleading, desperate, trying to lure me away from what I desperately hoped was still the right direction. I pressed my hands over my ears and kept walking straight ahead, even as the voices grew more frantic, more desperate. Some began to scream, long wailing cries that spoke of agony and despair. Others laughed, the sound sharp and broken like shattered glass. The worst part was when I started recognizing some of the voices. Sarah's voice called to me, begging me to come to her, saying she was sorry for leaving me and that she needed me to save her. My mother's voice, though she'd been dead for 10 years, called out warnings about the danger I was in. My father's voice, slurred with drink as it had been so often when I was a child, taunted me about being weak and worthless. I knew none of it was real, but knowing didn't make it any easier to resist. Each voice pulled at something deep in my chest, some primitive part of my brain that wanted to respond, to help, to run toward the familiar sounds even though I knew it would mean my death. As the sun began to set again, though it felt like I'd been walking for far longer than a single day, I found myself in another clearing. This one was larger than the first and filled with structures that made my mind rebel against what it was seeing. They might have been buildings once, but they'd been twisted into impossible geometries. Walls curved in directions that shouldn't exist, doorways opened onto starless voids, and windows showed views of landscapes that definitely weren't the Adirondacks. Some of the structures seemed to be made of bone and sinew rather than wood and stone, pulsing gently as if they were alive. In the center of the clearing stood a throne made of antlers and human skulls, and sitting on that throne was something that had once been a man. It was emaciated beyond belief. Its skin stretched tight over bones that jutted at sharp angles. Its fingers had extended into foot-long claws, and its teeth had grown into needle-sharp fangs that protruded from a mouth that had split wider than any human mouth should be able to open. But the worst part was its eyes. They were human eyes, intelligent and aware, trapped in this monstrous form. "Welcome, Kenneth," it said, and this time the voice was definitely not my own. It was ancient, hollow, the sound of wind through empty caves. "I've been waiting for you." I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The thing that had once been human leaned forward on its throne, and I could smell the decay rolling off it in waves. "Do you know what I am, Kenneth? Do you know what hunger can make of a man when he's left alone in these woods long enough?" I tried to speak, but only managed a strangled whisper. "Wendigo." It smiled, and the expression was obscene on that twisted face. Such an ugly word for something so liberating. "I was like you once. Lost, frightened, alone. I wandered these woods for days before I found this place, before I understood what was being offered to me." It gestured with one clawed hand at the impossible structures around us. "Power, Kenneth. Freedom from all the petty concerns that plague human existence. No more jobs to lose, no more lovers to abandon you, no more anxiety eating at your insides like acid. Just hunger, pure and simple. Hunger and the strength to satisfy it." The creature stood, and I saw that it was at least 8 feet tall, its emaciated frame somehow radiating terrible strength. "I can give you the same gift, Kenneth. All you have to do is accept it. Accept the hunger." "No," I whispered, then louder. "No!" I turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth with no regard for direction or stealth. Behind me, I heard the thing laugh, a sound like breaking bones. "You can't escape, Kenneth," it called after me. "This is my domain now. Every tree, every path, every shadow belongs to me. You'll run until you're exhausted, and then you'll crawl back here begging for the gift I offered." I ran anyway, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, my lungs burning with each desperate breath. The laughter followed me, seeming to come from all directions at once, echoing through the twisted forest like the voice of the damned. I don't know how long I ran. Time had lost all meaning in this place. The sun never moved. The shadows never shifted. and my watch had stopped working entirely. I ran until my legs gave out, then crawled until my arms gave out, then lay gasping on the forest floor, waiting for the end. That's when I saw the light. It was just a faint glow through the trees ahead, but it was warm and steady and completely unlike the sickly illumination that seemed to emanate from the Wendigo's domain. I forced myself to stand and stumbled toward it, hope fluttering in my chest like a wounded bird. The light came from a campfire, and sitting beside that fire was a man I didn't recognize. He was elderly, maybe in his 70s, with a white beard and calm eyes that looked up at me without surprise. "Sit," he said simply, gesturing to a log on the opposite side of the fire. "You look like you could use some rest." I collapsed gratefully, my whole body shaking with exhaustion and terror. The man handed me a cup of hot coffee that tasted like the most wonderful thing I'd ever drunk. "You met him, didn't you?" the old man said. It wasn't really a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I'm Samuel," he said. "I've been hunting that thing for 43 years." "Hunting it?" Samuel nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "My son was one of the first it took back in 1982. Jimmy was just 18, excited about his first solo camping trip. When the search parties found his campsite, there was blood everywhere but no body, no trace of where he'd gone." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. "I've been coming back here every few years since then, trying to understand what happened to him, learning about that thing, learning how to fight it." "How do you fight something like that?" Samuel smiled grimly. "Very carefully, and with a lot of help from the old spirits of these mountains. The Wendigo is strong, but it's not the only power in these woods. There are older things here, things that remember what this place was like before the hunger came." He reached into his pack and pulled out something that made my breath catch, a small leather pouch that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "Iron filings mixed with salt from tears shed in grief," he explained, "and something else. Tobacco, blessed by the Haudenosaunee elders. Their ancestors knew how to bind things like this, how to trap them. You can kill it? Not kill, but I can lock it away, keep it from claiming any more victims. The problem is getting close enough to use this." He held up the pouch. "It has to be sprinkled on the creature while it's feeding, while it's distracted. And that means someone has to be bait." I understood immediately. "You want me to go back?" "I want you to help me finish this. You're the first person to encounter it and escape alive in over 20 years. That's not an accident, Kenneth. Something protected you out there, guided you to me. Maybe it's time we both found some peace." I thought about all the voices I'd heard in the forest, all the bones scattered among the trees, all the people who'd come here looking for the same thing I was: solitude, peace, a chance to start over, and found only hunger and death. What do I have to do? Samuel outlined the plan as we sat by the fire through what should have been night but felt suspended outside of time. I would return to the Wendigo's clearing, pretending to accept its offer of transformation. While it was distracted by the process of changing me, apparently a ritual that required the creature to feed on its victim slowly, savoring the corruption of an innocent soul, Samuel would approach from behind and bind it with the blessed mixture. It was a terrible plan with almost no chance of success, but it was the only plan we had. As we prepared to leave his campsite, Samuel handed me something else, a small silver cross that felt warm to the touch. "This was Jimmy's," he said quietly. "It won't stop the creature, but it might give you a few extra seconds when you need them most." We walked through the forest in silence, Samuel navigating with an ease that spoke of decades spent in these woods. The trees around us remained twisted and wrong, but I noticed that they seemed to bend away from the old man, as if even in this corrupted place, something still respected his presence. The Wendigo's clearing appeared ahead of us just as it had before, filled with impossible structures and ruled by the creature on its throne of bones. But this time, I was ready for it. I walked into the clearing alone, hands raised in surrender, while Samuel melted into the shadows at the forest's edge. "I knew you'd return," the Wendigo said, its voice dripping with satisfaction. "Hunger always wins in the end. It's the only honest emotion humans possess." "I accept," I said, my voice steady despite the terror clawing at my insides. "I accept your gift." The creature's smile was horrific. "Wise choice. Come closer. Let me show you how beautiful transformation can be." I approached the throne, every instinct screaming at me to run. The Wendigo stood and reached out with one clawed hand, placing it on my shoulder. Its touch burned like ice, and I felt something cold and alien trying to worm its way into my mind. "Yes," it hissed, "I can taste your despair, your loneliness, your rage at a world that's failed you. Let me take all that pain away. Let me give you something pure to focus on." The corruption spread through my body like poison, turning my thoughts dark and savage. I could see the appeal of what it was offering. A life without doubt, without fear, without the constant anxiety that had plagued me for years. Just hunger and the power to satisfy it. But I held on to Jimmy's cross, using the pain of its burning silver against my palm to anchor myself to who I was. I thought about Sarah, about the good times before everything fell apart. I thought about my parents, about the hiking trips my father and I had taken before the drinking got bad. I thought about every person I'd ever loved, every moment of joy I'd experienced, every reason I had to remain human. The Wendigo leaned closer, its breath hot and fetid against my face. "Soon now. Soon you'll understand. Soon you'll thank me for freeing you from the burden of conscience." That's when Samuel struck. The old man moved with surprising speed for his age, sprinting across the clearing and hurling the contents of the leather pouch at the creature's back. The blessed mixture hit the Wendigo and burst into flames, not the red-orange flames of normal fire, but a cold blue radiance that seemed to burn from the inside out. The creature's scream was the most terrible sound I'd ever heard. Not just pain, but genuine terror. The sound of something that had thought itself immortal suddenly facing its own destruction. It released me and spun towards Samuel. Claws extended, but the binding mixture was already working. The Wendigo's movements became sluggish, its form beginning to blur at the edges. "No!" it shrieked. "I am eternal. I am hunger itself. You cannot bind me." But Samuel was already chanting in a language I didn't recognize, his voice steady and sure. The blue flames spread across the creature's body, and with each word the old man spoke, the Wendigo became more translucent. "This is not death," Samuel said, speaking now in English. "This is justice. For Jimmy, for all the others you've taken. Sleep now, and dream of the hunger you'll never satisfy again." The Wendigo made one last desperate lunge toward me, but its claws passed harmlessly through my body. It was already more spirit than flesh, fading like smoke in the wind. Its final scream echoed through the clearing, then cut off abruptly, leaving only silence. The impossible structures around us began to collapse, their geometries unwinding like smoke. The bone throne crumbled to dust, and the twisted trees straightened, their sickly bark returning to normal brown and gray. Even the scattered human bones dissolved, the souls of their former owners finally at rest. Samuel staggered, the effort of the binding ritual having drained him visibly. I caught his arm as he nearly fell. "Is it over?" I asked. He nodded wearily. "For now. The binding should hold for a century or more, maybe longer. By the time it weakens, I'll be long dead, but maybe someone else will take up the watch." "What happens now?" Samuel smiled, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked his age. "Now we go home. Both of us." The walk out of the forest was surprisingly easy. The trails were clear and well marked, just as they should have been. My GPS started working again as soon as we left the clearing, showing our position exactly where my map said it should be. Even my phone had battery power again, though I didn't trust myself to call anyone until I was back in civilization. We hiked out together, two men who'd faced something inhuman and survived. Samuel told me stories about his son, about the years of searching and the gradual realization that some evils couldn't be fought with conventional weapons. I told him about Sarah, about my job, about the anxiety and depression that had driven me into the wilderness in the first place. "Funny thing about facing real monsters," Samuel said as we reached the trailhead where his battered pickup truck waited beside my car. "Makes all the everyday demons seem a lot smaller." He was right. As I drove home through the mountain roads, I felt something lifting from my shoulders that had been there for years. The Wendigo had tried to corrupt me by feeding on my despair, but in resisting it, I'd found a strength I'd forgotten I possessed. I called Sarah that night. We talked for 3 hours, really talked, for the first time since she'd left. I didn't tell her about the Wendigo. How could I? But I told her about hiking alone, about facing my fears, about realizing what was truly important. We agreed to try again, to get counseling together, to work on the problems that had driven us apart. I also applied for new jobs, better jobs, positions that challenged me instead of slowly grinding away my soul. The anxiety was still there, but it felt manageable now, like a problem to be solved rather than a curse to be endured. Samuel and I stayed in touch. He sent me a letter a few months later telling me he'd felt Jimmy's presence in his dreams for the first time in 40 years. Not the tortured spirit the Wendigo had trapped, but his son as he'd been in life, at peace and grateful that his father had finally found closure. The old man died in his sleep the following winter. Natural causes, the obituary said. His nephew contacted me because Samuel had left instructions that I should have Jimmy's cross. I wear it now when I go hiking, which I do often. The wilderness isn't a place of terror anymore. It's a place of healing, of connection to something larger than my daily worries. But I stay on the marked trails, and I never hike alone near the Tahawus area, where the old maps show empty forest but the new ones mark a site of historical significance, access restricted. The Park Service has cordoned off that section of the High Peaks wilderness, citing unstable geological conditions. Sometimes when the wind is right and I'm camping near the boundary of that restricted zone, I think I can hear something calling from deep in the woods. It sounds almost like my own voice, but stretched and hollow, promising things I know better than to want. "The binding will hold," Samuel said, "for a century or more." I hope he was right, but if he wasn't, if someday that thing breaks free again, maybe there will be someone else ready to take up the watch. Someone else willing to face the hunger in the dark places of the world and say no. Because that's what makes us human in the end. Not our fears or our appetites or our weaknesses, but our ability to choose. To choose love over hate, connection over isolation, hope over despair. To choose to remain human, even when something offers us an easier path. The Wendigo understood hunger, but it never understood the one thing that could defeat it. The knowledge that some things are worth suffering for, worth staying human for, no matter how much it hurts. That knowledge saved my life, and maybe, if I'm very lucky, it will save someone else's too. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 27 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the High Peaks region in the Adirondack Mountains of New York, specifically near the abandoned logging camp at Santanoni Preserve, about 15 miles from the nearest road. I should have listened to the warnings about that place, but we were young, stupid, and desperate to get away from the suffocating monotony of our office jobs in Albany. The 5 of us, myself, my girlfriend Sarah Rodriguez, my college roommate Brian Wright, his sister Jennifer Williams, and our friend from work, Daniel Lopez, had planned this backpacking trip for months. We wanted isolation, wanted to disconnect completely from the digital world that had consumed our lives. The Santanoni Preserve seemed perfect. 46 square miles of pristine wilderness with the ruins of an old Gilded Age camp deep in the backcountry. Most hikers stuck to the main trails leading to the preserved Great Camp buildings, but we'd found obscure references to an abandoned logging operation from the 1920s, hidden in a valley that most maps didn't even show anymore. It would be a 4-day hike to reach it, 3 days to explore, and 4 days back. Pure wilderness, no cell service, no other people. The first sign something was wrong came on day 2 of our hike-in. We'd followed an old logging road that gradually deteriorated from gravel to dirt to barely visible twin ruts disappearing into the undergrowth. The GPS on my phone had died despite a full charge that morning, and the backup GPS unit Brian carried started showing impossible readings, coordinates that placed us simultaneously in 3 different states. "Technology," Brian laughed, tapping the screen. "This is why I brought paper maps." But when we spread out the topographical maps that evening at our campsite beside a nameless beaver pond, they seemed different. Contour lines didn't quite match what we could see around us. The pond we'd camped beside wasn't marked anywhere, despite clearly being decades old based on the weathered beaver dam. Sarah, who'd studied cartography in college, stared at the maps with growing confusion. "These elevations don't make sense," she said, tracing her finger along what should have been our route. "According to this, we should be standing in a valley, but we're clearly on high ground." Daniel, ever the pragmatist, shrugged. "Old maps. Probably surveyed wrong originally. As long as we can follow the logging road, we'll be fine." But the logging road was becoming harder to follow. What had been clear wheel ruts that morning became increasingly overgrown, until by late afternoon on day 3, we were following nothing more than slight depressions in the forest floor, marked by the occasional blaze on a tree. Blazes that looked far too fresh for a road abandoned nearly a century ago. The forest itself felt wrong. I'd grown up camping in the Adirondacks, knew the usual rhythm of wilderness sounds, but here, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional crack of settling wood. No birds sang. No squirrels chattered. Even the insects seemed muted, as if afraid to make noise. Jennifer was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "Something's watching us," she said as we set up camp on the 3rd night. We'd found a small clearing beside what might have once been a logging staging area. Rotted stumps and the skeletal remains of some kind of wooden structure provided the only evidence of human presence. "Don't be paranoid," Brian told his sister, but I caught him glancing over his shoulder more than once as we prepared dinner. The silence was getting to all of us. That night, our fire kept dying, not gradually burning down. Dying. The flames would simply gutter out, leaving us in the absolute darkness of deep wilderness. Each time, we'd rebuild it with dry wood we'd carefully gathered, but within an hour, it would die again. By the 4th time, Daniel suggested we just let it go. "Maybe the wood's too green," he said, though we all knew that wasn't true. The wood was seasoned, dry as bone. Sarah insisted we keep trying. "I'm not sleeping without a fire," she said, and I could hear the edge of fear in her voice that she was trying to hide. "Not out here." The 5th time the fire died, something moved in the darkness beyond our circle of failing light. Something large enough to make the underbrush crackle, but too quiet for its size. We all heard it, but when Brian swept his flashlight beam across the tree line, there was nothing there. "Bear?" Jennifer whispered. "Bears make more noise," I said, keeping my voice steady, "and they usually avoid campfires." We managed to keep the fire burning the rest of the night by taking shifts, feeding it constantly. But none of us slept well, and in the morning, we found something that made our situation much worse. Daniel was gone. His sleeping bag was empty but unzipped from the inside, as if he'd gotten out normally. His boots were missing, but everything else, backpack, clothes, wallet, everything, remained exactly where he'd left it. There were no footprints leading away from the campsite, no sign of a struggle, no indication of where he'd gone or why. "Daniel!" Brian shouted, his voice echoing off the surrounding hills. "Daniel!" We spent the morning searching, expanding our search pattern in widening circles around the campsite. The forest swallowed our voices, returning only mocking echoes and that oppressive silence. By noon, we had to face the possibility that something serious had happened. "We need to go back," Sarah said. "Hike out and get help." But when we tried to retrace our route, we discovered another problem. The logging road, or what remained of it, had vanished. The trees seemed different. The landmarks we'd carefully noted changed. The blazes that had marked our path were gone, as if they'd never existed. "This is impossible," Jennifer said, staring at a massive pine tree that should have been on our left but was now on our right. "Trees don't move." Brian checked his compass, then checked it again. "We're still heading southwest. This should be the right direction." But southwest led to a cliff face that definitely hadn't been there before, a sheer drop of at least 60 feet into a ravine that wasn't on any of our maps. Sarah spread out the topographical charts again, her hands shaking. "Nothing matches," she said. It's like the landscape is changing." We spent the day searching for another route out, but every direction led to either impassable terrain or simply more of the same endless forest. As evening approached, we were forced to make camp again, this time in a small grove of white pines that offered some protection from the wind that had started picking up. The fire died again within minutes of lighting it. That's when Daniel came back. We heard him before we saw him, footsteps in the darkness beyond our circle of failing flashlight beams. Slow, measured steps that didn't quite sound right, as if each foot was being placed with deliberate care. "Daniel," Brian called out. "Daniel, is that you?" The footsteps stopped. "Daniel, come into the light, man. We've been looking for you all day." A figure stepped into the edge of our beam. It was Daniel, same height, same build, same clothes he'd been wearing when he disappeared. But something was wrong. He stood too still, his arms hanging at his sides like a marionette with cut strings. His face was in shadow, but what we could see didn't look right. His smile was too wide, stretching his lips in a way that made my skin crawl. "Found," he said, and his voice sounded hollow, like an echo of itself. "Found the way." "Thank God," Jennifer said, starting to stand. "Where have you been? We were terrified something had happened to you." Daniel's head tilted at an angle that was slightly too sharp, like a bird studying prey. "Down below, in the old place. They showed me." "Who showed you?" Sarah asked, and I could hear the wariness in her voice that matched my own growing unease. "The hungry ones." Brian laughed nervously. "Come on, man, sit down. You're scaring the girls. Where did you go? We couldn't find any tracks." Daniel's smile widened further, and now I could see his teeth in the flashlight beam. They looked wrong, sharper than they should be, and stained dark. "Hungry ones showed me the true path, the path down where the meat is tender and the bones crack so sweetly." My blood went cold. That wasn't Daniel. It looked like Daniel, sounded roughly like Daniel, but everything about the way it stood, the way it spoke, the way it watched us without blinking, none of it was right. "Daniel," I said carefully, "why don't you sit down and tell us what happened? You're acting strange." The thing wearing Daniel's face turned its attention to me, and I felt my breath catch. Its eyes reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's, but no human eyes did that. Not Daniel's brown eyes. "Strange," it repeated, tilting its head the other way. "Nothing strange about hunger. Nothing strange about eating." Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Michael," she whispered, "that's not Daniel." The thing heard her. Its head snapped toward her with the quick, predatory movement of a hunting animal, and its smile became something terrible. "Sarah knows. Sarah smells fear. Fear makes the meat tender." It started toward her, and I moved without thinking, putting myself between them. "Stay back." The Daniel thing stopped, studying me with those wrong eyes. Michael protects. Michael would taste bitter with adrenaline. Bitter meat. But Sarah. It inhaled deeply through its nose. Sarah would be sweet. Brian was on his feet now, backing away. "What the hell is wrong with you, Daniel? This isn't funny." "Nothing wrong," the thing said, still staring at Sarah with that horrible hunger. "Everything right. Everything perfect down below. The hungry ones taught me. Want to show you. Want to show you all," Jennifer screamed. She was pointing past the Daniel thing, into the darkness beyond our light. More figures were emerging from the forest, shapes that moved wrong, that stood too still when they stopped. I counted at least 4, maybe more. "Run," I said quietly. "Everyone run. Now." We scattered. I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward what I hoped was the direction opposite from most of the figures. Behind us, I heard Brian shouting for Jennifer, heard crashes in the underbrush as whatever those things were gave chase. The forest at night was a nightmare of grasping branches and hidden roots. Sarah stumbled repeatedly, and each time I hauled her back to her feet expecting claws to rake across our backs. The darkness was absolute. Our flashlights had died along with everything else electronic, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. We ran blindly, guided only by the sound of pursuit behind us and some desperate instinct that kept us moving forward. Branches tore at our clothes, rocks bruised our shins, and still we ran. After what felt like hours, we stopped in a small hollow between 2 fallen trees, gasping for breath and straining to listen. The pursuit had fallen behind, but we could still hear them calling to each other through the darkness. Voices that sounded almost human but carried too far, lasted too long. "What were those things?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I said, though deep down I was starting to. My grandmother had told me stories when I was young, stories about the things that lived in the deep woods of the Adirondacks. The Iroquois had names for them: Wendigo, Windigo, creatures that had once been human but had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Things that wore familiar faces but were driven by an endless, terrible hunger. "We have to find Brian and Jennifer," Sarah said. I wanted to tell her they were probably dead, that we should focus on getting ourselves out of this nightmare. But the hope in her voice stopped me. "Okay," I said, "but we stay together, no matter what." We moved carefully through the darkness, using the sound of the calling voices to guide us. They seemed to be moving in a pattern, searching methodically. Whatever these things were, they were intelligent, organized. We found Jennifer first. She was hiding in a cluster of boulders about half a mile from where we'd scattered, crying silently and clutching a broken branch like a weapon. When she saw us, she nearly sobbed with relief. "They got Brian," she whispered. "They surrounded him. I heard him screaming, and then nothing." My heart sank, but I forced myself to think practically. 3 of us now, in unknown terrain, being hunted by things that knew the forest better than we did. Our only advantage was that they seemed to be toying with us, calling out rather than simply tracking us down efficiently. "We need to keep moving," I said. "Find some place defensible to wait for dawn." But as we moved through the forest, I started to realize something terrible. The voices weren't just searching randomly, they were herding us. Every time we tried to move in one direction, a voice would call out from that way, forcing us to change course. We were being driven somewhere specific. The realization came too late. We stumbled into a clearing just as the clouds parted, and moonlight revealed where we'd been led. The ruins of the old logging camp spread before us. Not the small staging area where we'd camped, but the main operation. Skeletal remains of buildings, rusted machinery, and in the center, a large structure that might once have been a mess hall or bunkhouse. They were waiting for us. Daniel stood in the doorway of the main building, still wearing that horrible smile. Around the clearing, other figures emerged from the shadows. Brian, but wrong, like Daniel was wrong, moving with that same unnatural stillness. And others, dressed in clothing from different eras. A man in a flannel shirt that looked decades old. A woman in a dress that might have been from the 1920s. A child, Jesus, a child, wearing overalls and a cap but standing with the same predatory stillness as the adults. "Welcome," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Welcome to the feast." The figures began to move toward us, not running but walking with deliberate, terrifying patience. Sarah grabbed my hand, her nails digging into my palm. "The building," I said. "Maybe we can barricade ourselves inside." But as we ran toward the nearest structure, what looked like it might have been a tool shed, Daniel laughed. It was a sound like wind through dead leaves, like the crack of breaking bones. "Running makes it better," he called after us. "Fear seasons the meat." We reached the shed and threw ourselves against the door. It was locked, but the wood was old and rotten. I put my shoulder into it and the door splintered inward, dumping us into dusty darkness. Sarah fumbled for her phone. Miracle of miracles, it flickered to life, providing just enough light to see. The shed was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, filled with rusted tools and equipment. There was another door at the back, probably leading to the main complex. "Help me barricade this," I said, grabbing a heavy workbench. Jennifer joined me, and together we shoved it against the door we'd broken through. Sarah found some old boards and we wedged them across the door frame. Outside, we could hear them gathering. Footsteps circled the building, and occasionally one of them would test the door or scratch at the walls, but they didn't seem to be in any hurry to break in. "Why aren't they attacking?" Jennifer whispered. I was wondering the same thing. They'd had plenty of opportunities to catch us in the open, but instead they'd herded us here, into this building, like they wanted us trapped. The answer came in a voice from right outside the wall, Brian's voice, but with that same wrong inflection as Daniel's. "Meat tastes better when it's aged," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "When it's had time to think about what's coming. Fear and despair, they change the chemistry, make it sweeter." Sarah whimpered and I pulled her close. On the other side of the shed, something heavy slammed against the wall, making the whole structure shake. Old dust rained down from the ceiling. "How long can we hold out?" Jennifer asked. I looked around the shed, taking inventory. Some old tools, a few boards, nothing that would serve as a real weapon. The phone's battery was draining fast. Maybe 20 minutes of light left. After that, we'd be in complete darkness with things that could see perfectly well hunting us. Another impact against the wall, harder this time. Whatever they were using to test our defenses was working. I could see gaps opening between the boards. "There," Sarah said, pointing to the back of the shed. "That door. Maybe we can get to the main building. Find a better place to defend." It was our only option. The back door was newer than the front, with a modern padlock holding it shut. I grabbed a rusty crowbar from the tool collection and went to work on the lock. Behind us, the barricaded door shuddered under another impact. The lock snapped just as the front barricade gave way. Moonlight streamed through the opening, silhouetting Daniel as he stepped through. In the phone light, I could see that his face was changing, becoming something less human with each passing moment. His jaw was too long, his teeth definitely sharper, and his eyes reflected the light like mirrors. "Run," I said, shoving Sarah and Jennifer through the back door. We tumbled into a connecting hallway that led to the main building. The corridor was longer than it should have been, stretching away into darkness that seemed to swallow our phone light. The walls were lined with doors, some hanging open to reveal empty rooms, others sealed shut. Behind us, Daniel's voice echoed in the shed. "Clever little mice. But mice always get caught eventually." We ran down the hall, our footsteps echoing strangely in the confined space. Some of the doors we passed had scratches on them, deep gouges in the wood that looked like claw marks. Others had dark stains around the frames that I didn't want to identify. The hallway ended in a larger room, the old mess hall, judging by the long tables and benches scattered around. Moonlight streamed through broken windows, casting everything in silver and shadow. At the far end of the room, a staircase led up to what might have been sleeping quarters. "Upstairs," I said. "Higher ground." But as we crossed the mess hall, Jennifer suddenly stopped. "Listen," she whispered. From somewhere in the building came a sound that made my blood freeze. A low, rhythmic chanting in a language I didn't recognize. It seemed to be coming from below us, from underneath the building. "There's a basement," Sarah said, staring at the floor. "They're in the basement." The chanting grew louder, and with it came other sounds. Scraping, like claws on stone. Wet, tearing noises that I really didn't want to think about. And underneath it all, a sound that might have been screaming, if screams could last for hours. We made it to the staircase just as the things from outside began pouring into the mess hall. They moved differently now, dropping the pretense of being human. Daniel led them, but the thing wearing his face was only barely recognizable. Its limbs were too long, its movement too fluid, and when it opened its mouth I could see rows of needle-sharp teeth. The others were just as changed. Brian's face had become gaunt and predatory, his fingers ending in black claws. The woman in the old dress moved like a spider, her joints bending in ways that should have been impossible. We ran up the stairs 3 at a time, the old wood creaking under our weight. The second floor was a maze of small rooms, the old bunkhouse with narrow beds and broken furniture scattered everywhere. We found a room at the end of the hall with only one door and barricaded ourselves in again. The chanting from below was getting louder, and now I could make out individual words. Latin, maybe, or something older. The rhythm was hypnotic, threatening to pull at something deep in my mind that I didn't want touched. "What do they want?" Jennifer asked, huddled against the far wall. "They're hungry," Sarah said quietly. "That's all they are now. Just hunger." Through the thin walls, we could hear them moving through the building, searching room by room. They weren't in any hurry. They knew we had nowhere to go. The scratching sounds were getting closer, accompanied by that awful wet tearing noise. My phone finally died, plunging us into complete darkness. In the silence that followed, we could hear our own breathing, our own heartbeats, and the steady approach of things that had once been human. The door handle turned slowly. I pressed myself against the wall beside the door, the crowbar raised. Sarah and Jennifer crouched behind an overturned bed frame. The door opened with a creak that seemed to last forever. Daniel's silhouette filled the doorway, backlit by moonlight from the hallway. But it wasn't really Daniel anymore. The proportions were all wrong, the head too large, the limbs too long. "Little mice," it said in a voice like grinding bone. "Time to come out and play." I swung the crowbar with everything I had. It connected with the thing's skull with a wet crack, sending it stumbling backward. Black ichor splattered the walls, but the creature didn't go down. Instead, it turned toward me with a sound that might have been laughter. "Iron hurts," it said, reaching up to touch the wound I'd opened. "But hunger heals." As I watched in horror, the gash in its skull began to close, the broken bone knitting back together with wet, clicking sounds. Within moments, there was no sign I'd ever heard it. "My turn," it said and lunged. I dove aside and its claws raked deep furrows in the wall where my head had been. Sarah screamed and I heard Jennifer sobbing behind the bed frame. The creature moved like liquid shadow, flowing around the small room with impossible grace. I swung the crowbar again, caught it across the ribs with a blow that would have dropped a human. The thing barely flinched. Instead, it grabbed the bar and yanked it from my hands, tossing it aside like a toy. "Enough games," it said, reaching for me with those terrible claws. That's when the building shook. Not from the creature's movements, but from something much larger. The floor vibrated under our feet, and dust rained from the ceiling. From somewhere below came a sound like a building-sized door being torn open. The Daniel thing froze, its head tilting to listen. The chanting from below had stopped, replaced by sound like wind through a cave, if caves could scream. "No," the creature whispered, and for the first time I heard fear in its voice. "Not yet. Not ready." The building shook again, harder this time. Through the broken windows I could see the forest beyond beginning to move, trees swaying despite the lack of wind. The very air seemed to be pulling toward the building, as if something below was drawing breath. "What's happening?" Sarah asked. The Daniel thing turned toward her, and its face was no longer even remotely human. "The deep hunger wakes," it said. "The true feast begins." The floor cracked under our feet. Through the gaps, I could see a red glow rising from below and smell something that was part charnel house, part sulfur, part things that should never have names. "We have to get out of here," I said, grabbing Sarah's hand. "Now!" But the creature blocked our path to the door, and behind it, I could see others gathering in the hallway. They looked terrified. if things like that could feel terror, but they weren't going to let us leave. The building shook a third time, and this time the floor gave way. We fell through splintering wood into the mess hall below, landing hard on the overturned tables. Pain shot through my shoulder where I hit, but adrenaline kept me moving. Sarah and Jennifer landed near me, groaning but alive. Above us, the creatures were chittering to each other in that same unknown language, but now their voices held panic. Whatever was happening below, they feared it more than they wanted us. The red glow was stronger down here, seeping up through cracks in the floor. The building continued to shake, and I realized that the structure itself was sinking, being pulled down into whatever lay beneath. "The windows," I said, pointing to the broken glass at the far end of the room. "We go out the windows." We ran, dodging falling debris as the building continued its inexorable descent into the earth. Behind us, I could hear the creatures falling through the broken floor above, their inhuman voices rising in panic. I reached the window first and kicked out the remaining glass, then helped Sarah and Jennifer climb through. As I pulled myself over the sill, I looked back once. The mess hall was sinking into a pit that definitely hadn't been there before, a pit that glowed with red light from depths I couldn't fathom. The creatures that had been hunting us were sliding down toward that light, scrabbling at the walls but unable to escape the pull. The last thing I saw before we ran into the forest was Daniel, or what had been Daniel, reaching up toward us from the edge of the pit. For just a moment his face looked human again, terrified and pleading. "Help me," he mouthed. Then the red light swallowed him, and the building collapsed completely into the earth. We ran through the forest until dawn, guided by some instinct that led us steadily uphill. When the sun finally rose, we found ourselves on a ridge overlooking a valley that looked nothing like where we'd been the night before. Below us, a perfectly normal forest stretched to the horizon, with no sign of any buildings, new or old. The logging road was back, clear and well-defined, leading straight toward distant power lines that marked civilization. My phone had battery again, and the GPS showed our exact location, exactly where we should have been according to our original maps. We hiked out in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. When we finally reached the parking area where we'd left Brian's car, we found search and rescue teams preparing to look for us. We'd been missing for 5 days, they said, though it felt like we'd only been in the woods for 3. They asked about Brian and Daniel, and we told them what we could, that they'd gotten separated from us in the dark, that we'd looked but couldn't find them. Search teams scoured the area for weeks afterward but found no trace. The official report listed them as lost in the wilderness, probably fallen into one of the many ravines that honeycomb the High Peaks region. Sarah and I broke up 3 months later. Neither of us could talk about what we'd seen without the other person flinching, and the memories were too strong to ignore. Jennifer moved to California and refuses to discuss the trip at all. When reporters occasionally call on the anniversary, asking about the Santanoni 5 and what really happened to our missing friends, we give the same story. Lost in the woods, tragic accident, no further comment. But sometimes, late at night when the wind picks up and the trees outside my window sway in the darkness, I hear that chanting again. And I know that somewhere in the deep woods of the Adirondacks, the hungry ones are still waiting, still feeding on those foolish enough to stray too far from the light. The search teams never found the ruins of any logging camp. According to the Historical Society, there was never any major logging operation in that part of the preserve. The maps show unbroken forest stretching for miles in every direction. But I know what I saw. I know what took Daniel and Brian, and I know it's still out there, wearing their faces, calling to new victims in voices that sound almost, but not quite, human. Sometimes I dream about that red light rising from the pit, and I wake up wondering if we really escaped at all, or if we're still down there, still running through endless hallways while something that was once our friend hunts us through the dark. The worst part is the doubt, because every now and then I catch Sarah looking at me with eyes that reflect light they shouldn't, and her smile lasts just a little too long. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York, near Algonquin Peak, during what was supposed to be a 3-day hiking trip that would change everything I believed about the world. David Jones had been my closest friend since college, the kind of guy who could talk you into anything with his infectious enthusiasm and that crooked grin that made even the worst ideas seem brilliant. When he suggested we tackle the High Peaks Wilderness in early November, I should have known better. The tourist season was over, the weather was unpredictable, and most sane people had already winterized their gear. But David had this way of making you feel like a coward if you didn't jump at his latest adventure. "Come on, Mike," he'd said, leaning across the table at Murphy's Pub in Albany, his eyes bright with that familiar manic energy. "When's the last time we did something real? Something that actually mattered?" He gestured broadly, nearly knocking over his beer. "We're slowly dying in those cubicles, man. We need this." I'd been reluctant. My job at the insurance company was soul-crushing, sure, but it was stable, safe. David worked construction and had a different relationship with risk than I did. Still, something in his voice that night convinced me. Maybe it was the way he'd been drinking more lately, or how he'd mentioned his dad's recent diagnosis. Lung cancer. 6 months, maybe less. 3 days, I'd said finally. But we do this right. No cutting corners. David's grin had been answer enough. Now, standing at the Heart Lake trailhead with our packs loaded and the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the bare November trees, I felt the familiar pre-adventure mixture of excitement and anxiety. The parking area was nearly empty. Just our rented Jeep and one other vehicle, a rusted pickup truck that looked like it had been there for weeks. "Beautiful, isn't it?" David said, adjusting his pack straps. He'd bought all new gear for this trip, top-of-the-line everything. Unlike my well-worn equipment, his bright blue pack and pristine hiking boots screamed amateur. "Look at those mountains, Mike. When's the last time you saw something that made you feel small in a good way?" I had to admit, the view was spectacular. The Adirondack peaks stretched out before us like ancient sentinels, their slopes already dusted with early snow. Algonquin Peak, our destination, loomed in the distance at over 5,000 feet. We planned to camp at Wright Peak Lean-To tonight, then summit Algonquin tomorrow before heading back. "Weather looks good," I said, checking my phone one last time. "Full bars, clear skies predicted through tomorrow. Ready." The first hour of hiking felt perfect. The trail was well marked, winding through dense hardwood forest that still held some of its autumn color. David kept up a steady stream of chatter, reminiscing about our college days, making grand plans for future adventures. His voice echoed slightly in the crisp air, and I found myself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of putting one foot in front of the other. But as the sun began to sink lower, painting the forest in amber light, something started to feel off. It was subtle at first, just a growing sense that we were being watched. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently, scanning the shadows between the trees. The rational part of my mind knew it was just normal woods paranoia, the primal awareness that comes from being in unfamiliar territory. But the feeling persisted, a prickle at the base of my neck that wouldn't go away. "You feel that?" I asked David during a water break. "Feel what?" He was grinning, completely at ease. "Nothing. Never mind." As darkness fell, we reached Wright Peak Lean-To, a 3-sided wooden shelter built into the mountainside. The structure was solid and well-maintained, but something about it felt wrong. Maybe it was the way our flashlight beams seemed to get swallowed by the darkness beyond the shelter, or how the forest had gone unnaturally quiet. Even the wind had died down to nothing. "This is perfect," David said, dropping his pack with a heavy thud that echoed strangely in the stillness. "We've got the whole place to ourselves." I helped him clear debris from the shelter floor, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The darkness pressed in around us like a living thing, and our headlamps created a small bubble of light that only emphasized how vast and empty everything else was. "Fire?" David asked, already gathering wood. "Yeah, good idea. but the fire wouldn't catch. We tried everything: different tinder, repositioning the logs, even using some emergency fire starter I'd brought. The flames would flicker to life briefly, then die out as if something was sucking the oxygen away. After the fourth failed attempt, David sat back on his heels, frustrated. "What the hell?" he muttered. Finally, on the fifth try, the fire caught and held, but the flames burned strangely, lower than they should have, with an odd blue tinge around the edges. The light seemed to barely penetrate the darkness around us, creating a claustrophobic pocket of visibility that made me feel like we were trapped in a tiny room with black walls pressing in from all sides. "Probably just the altitude," I said, trying to convince myself as much as David. "Different air pressure." We ate our dehydrated meals in relative silence, both of us unconsciously speaking in whispers. The normal forest sounds, owls, rustling leaves, the distant howl of coyotes, were completely absent. It was as if every living thing had fled the area, leaving us alone with something that didn't belong. "Mike," David said suddenly, his voice tight, "check your phone." I pulled out my iPhone and my blood went cold. No signal, not even a single bar. But that wasn't the weird part. The time display was wrong. According to my phone, it was 3:47 a.m. I looked at my watch, 8:23 p.m. "Mine too," David said, holding up his Android. It showed 11:15 p.m. "What the fuck is going on?" "Probably just the mountains interfering with the signal," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. "You know how it is up here." David nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The easy confidence he'd maintained all day was starting to crack. We tried to settle in for the night, but sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that presence again, something watching us from just beyond the fire's reach. The flames continued to burn with that unsettling blue tint, casting weird shadows that seemed to move independently of the flickering light. Around what my watch insisted was midnight, David sat up abruptly. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I'd been dozing fitfully, so it took me a moment to focus. Then I heard it, a sound like branches breaking, but rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps, but wrong somehow, too heavy with an odd dragging quality. "Probably just a deer," I said, but I was already reaching for my flashlight. The sound came again, closer this time. Then a low moan that raised every hair on my body. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't animal either. It was something in between, a sound full of hunger and pain that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Jesus," David breathed. "What was that?" The sound faded, leaving us staring into the darkness with our flashlights, seeing nothing but tree trunks and shadows. We stayed awake until dawn, taking turns on watch, but whatever had made that sound never came closer. As the sun finally began to rise, painting the mountains in soft pastels, we both felt foolish for our night terrors. "Probably just our imagination," David said, forcing a laugh. "First night in the woods, you know? Makes you hear things." I wanted to believe him, but something had changed during the night. David seemed different somehow, more subdued, less animated. He moved through his morning routine mechanically, checking his gear with none of his usual enthusiasm. "You okay?" I asked as we broke camp. "Yeah, just tired. Didn't sleep much." He looked up at me, and for a split second, something flickered in his eyes, something that didn't look quite right. "Ready to bag this peak?" The hike to Algonquin's summit started normally enough. The trail was steep but well-maintained, winding through dense spruce and fir trees that blocked out most of the early morning light. David had regained some of his energy, chattering about the technical aspects of the climb and pointing out interesting rock formations. But I noticed he kept looking back over his shoulder, as if checking to see if we were being followed. About halfway up, things started going wrong. It began with my GPS unit. The screen flickered, showing our position jumping randomly across the map before finally displaying an error message I'd never seen before. "Location not found." I tried resetting it, but the device refused to acknowledge that we existed anywhere on Earth. Technology, I muttered, shoving it back into my pack, never works when you actually need it. But David's compass was acting up too, the needle spinning wildly before settling on directions that made no sense. According to the magnetic reading, north was behind us, which would put the peak in completely the wrong direction. "We'll navigate by landmarks," I said, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. "We can see the summit from here." Except we couldn't. The peak that had been clearly visible from the lean-to seemed to have vanished, hidden behind a wall of clouds that hadn't been in the weather forecast. The trees around us looked different too, older, more gnarled, with branches that seemed to reach toward us like skeletal fingers. "This doesn't feel right," David said, stopping abruptly. His face was pale, and he kept glancing at the forest around us as if expecting something to jump out. "Maybe we should head back." I was about to agree when we heard it again, that same moaning sound from the night before, but closer now. Much closer. It seemed to come from ahead of us on the trail, blocking our path to the summit. "Fuck this," David said, backing away. "I'm serious, Mike. Something's not right here." But as we turned to retreat, the sound came again from behind us, then from the left, then the right. We were surrounded by whatever was making that inhuman noise, trapped on a narrow section of trail with steep drops on both sides. "Stay calm," I said, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "It's probably just echo effects. Sound can do weird things in the mountains." David wasn't listening. He was staring into the trees to our left, his mouth hanging open. I followed his gaze and felt my own jaw drop. There was something moving through the forest parallel to the trail, something tall and pale that seemed to glide between the trees without disturbing the underbrush. It was too far away to make out clearly, but there was something fundamentally wrong about its proportions. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. "We need to go," David whispered. "Now." We started back down the trail, moving as quickly as we dared on the steep terrain. Behind us, the moaning continued, joined now by other sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and what might have been laughter if laughter could sound like wind through a graveyard. The descent became a nightmare of wrong turns and false paths. Trails that we remembered clearly from the ascent seemed to have vanished, replaced by barely visible game paths that led deeper into the wilderness. Our maps, when we could consult them, showed terrain that didn't match what we were seeing. It was as if the mountain itself was shifting around us, rearranging itself to keep us lost. "This is impossible," I panted, stopping to check the compass again. The needle was spinning freely now, unable to find magnetic north. "We've been going downhill for 3 hours. We should have reached the lean-to by now." David wasn't answering. He stood about 10 feet ahead of me on the trail, perfectly still, staring into the forest. Something about his posture sent ice through my veins. "David?" He turned around slowly, and I saw that his expression had changed. The fear and confusion were gone, replaced by something that might have been amusement. But his eyes were wrong, too wide, too bright, like someone had turned up the contrast on a photograph. "I know where we are," he said, and his voice was different too, flatter, like he was reading from a script. "We need to go deeper." "Deeper?" I backed away from him. "David, we need to get out of here. We need to find the main trail. The main trail doesn't matter anymore." He smiled, but it was too wide, showing too many teeth. "We're expected elsewhere." That's when I knew for certain that whatever was standing in front of me wasn't really my friend anymore. Something had gotten into David during the night, something that was wearing his face but hadn't quite figured out how to use it properly. I ran. The forest became a blur of brown and green as I crashed through the underbrush, following animal paths and stream beds, anything that led away from the thing that used to be David. Behind me, I could hear pursuit. Not just footsteps, but that awful moaning sound, getting closer with each passing moment. The trees began to change as I fled deeper into the wilderness. They grew larger and more twisted. their bark scarred with strange markings that looked almost like hieroglyphs. The very air felt different, thicker, harder to breathe, with an underlying smell of decay that made my stomach churn. I stumbled into a clearing and immediately knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The space was perfectly circular, ringed by ancient pines that seemed to lean inward like spectators in an arena. In the center stood a structure that had no business existing in the Adirondack wilderness. A crude shelter made from human bones, with a roof of stretched skin that fluttered in a wind I couldn't feel. That's where I found David, the real David. He was hanging from one of the pine trees at the edge of the clearing, suspended by ropes made from braided sinew. His body was intact but wrong, drained of something essential that had left him looking like a deflated balloon. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. "He lasted longer than most," said a voice behind me. I spun around to see the thing that had been wearing David's face, but it wasn't trying to maintain the disguise anymore. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, with skin like moldy parchment stretched over a frame of twisted bone. Its fingers ended in black claws, and its face was a horrible mixture of human and animal features. A wolf's snout, filled with needle-sharp teeth, but with David's eyes staring out from sunken sockets. "A Wendigo," I whispered, finally understanding what we'd encountered. "Your people have such limited names for us," it said, its voice like wind through a cemetery. "We are hunger. We are the price of trespass. We are what happens when prey wanders too far from the safety of the herd." It began to circle me, moving with predatory grace. "Your friend fought well. His fear was exquisite, but you smell different. Your terror has deeper roots." I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The thing continued its slow circle, savoring my paralysis. "I can taste your childhood trauma," it whispered. "The night your father left, sitting in the dark closet, listening to your parents scream at each other, wondering if the monsters under your bed were real after all." It laughed, a sound like bones breaking. "They were, little boy. We've always been real." The mention of that night, the worst night of my childhood when I'd hidden in my bedroom closet for hours while my parents destroyed their marriage and my sense of security, broke something loose in my mind. The paralyzing fear gave way to rage, pure and clean and focused. I dove for my pack, which I'd dropped at the edge of the clearing. My fingers found the emergency flare I'd packed, the one David had teased me about bringing. "What are you going to do? Signal for help?" he'd said. "We're not going to get that lost." The Wendigo lunged for me as I pulled the pin, but I was already rolling away. The flare ignited with a brilliant red light that seemed to physically hurt the creature. It shrieked and stumbled backward, covering its eyes with those horrible clawed hands. "Magnesium burns at 3 degrees," I said, getting to my feet. "Let's see how your stolen skin handles that." I threw the flare directly at its chest. The creature caught fire like it was made of paper, the flames spreading across its body with unnatural speed. It screamed again, but this time the sound was filled with genuine pain and fear. The borrowed flesh began to peel away, revealing something even worse underneath, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that had no fixed form. But it wasn't finished. Even as it burned, the Wendigo lunged at me with its remaining strength, claws extended toward my throat. I threw myself backward, landing hard on the rocky ground as the creature's momentum carried it past me and into the bone shelter. The structure collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning sinew, burying the Wendigo under a pile of flaming debris. The screaming continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, gradually fading to whispers, then silence. I lay on the ground, staring up at the darkening sky until I realized the forest sounds had returned. Birds were singing. Wind was moving through the trees. The oppressive wrongness that had filled the air was gone, replaced by normal Adirondack wilderness. My phone showed the correct time again, and when I climbed a nearby ridge I could see Heart Lake in the distance. It took me 6 hours to hike out, following real trails marked on real maps that led to a real parking lot where our Jeep waited exactly where we'd left it. I told the park rangers that David had fallen during the descent from Algonquin Peak, that his body was somewhere on the north face where I couldn't reach it. They mounted a search that lasted 3 days but found nothing. Eventually, they classified him as missing, presumed dead in a hiking accident. I've never told anyone the real story. Who would believe it? But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if there are other clearings hidden in remote places, other bone shelters maintained by things that hunger for more than food. I wonder how many missing hikers have fed those appetites, and how many more will disappear before we learn to respect the boundaries between our world and theirs. The insurance settlement from David's death was substantial enough to change my life. I quit my job, moved to a small town in Vermont, and now I work as a freelance web designer. I never go hiking anymore, and I sleep with every light in the house turned on. Because in the deepest part of the night, when the wind is howling through the trees outside my window, I sometimes hear that awful moaning sound again. And I know that somewhere in the wilderness, something is still hungry. Something that remembers the taste of fear and the sound of my name. My name is Michael Williams and I am 28 years old. This happened in the high peaks wilderness of the Adirondack Mountains, New York, 3 months ago. I still wake up screaming. David Jones had been my best friend since college. We'd been planning this camping trip to Mount Marcy for over a year, both of us needing to escape the suffocating corporate grind of Manhattan. David worked in finance, I was in marketing, and we were both burning out fast. The plan was simple. Hike the Van Hoevenberg Trail to the base camp near Lake Tier of the Clouds, spend 3 days in complete isolation, then summit Mount Marcy before heading back to civilization. Looking back now, I should have seen the warning signs. David had always been the more cautious one between us, the guy who triple-checked weather reports and carried backup batteries for everything. But in the weeks leading up to our trip, he'd become reckless, almost manic in his enthusiasm for getting back to nature. He'd started reading obsessively about wilderness survival, spending hours on forums dedicated to primitive living and off-grid experiences. "We're going to do this right, Mike," he'd said during one of our planning sessions, his eyes bright with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. No GPS reliance, no cell phone safety net. Just us and the mountain, the way people used to do it. I'd laughed it off at the time, but there was something in his voice that bothered me. A hunger, almost, like he was starving for something I couldn't understand. "Just us and the wilderness, Mike," David had said, grinning as he loaded his oversized backpack into my Jeep. "No phones, no emails, no bullshit, just like the old days." His backpack was massive, at least 80 liters, and stuffed with gear I didn't recognize. When I asked him about it, he'd just shrugged and said he wanted to be prepared for anything. There were coils of rope, multiple knives, emergency rations for 2 weeks, and what looked like metal animal traps wrapped in cloth. "Jesus, Dave, we're only going for 3 days, not 3 months, I'd joked, but he hadn't laughed. "You never know what you might need up there," he'd said, his eyes scanning the tree line as if something might emerge from the forest at any moment. That should have been my first warning. David had changed dramatically over the past few months. It started small, canceling our usual Friday night drinks, missing our weekly basketball games. Then it escalated. He'd become obsessed with survivalist shows and YouTube channels, constantly talking about getting back to basics and remembering what it means to be human. His apartment had transformed into something resembling a doomsday prepper's bunker, filled with camping gear, hunting knives, preserved foods, and books about primitive living with titles like Embracing the Predator Within and The Ancient Hunger. His girlfriend, Sarah, had broken up with him 2 weeks before our trip. When I'd asked what happened, she'd pulled me aside at a mutual friend's party and whispered, "He's become weird and distant, Mike. Really weird. He keeps talking about voices in his dreams, about something calling to him from the mountains." Last week, I found him standing in his kitchen at 3 a.m, just staring out the window toward upstate. When I asked what he was doing, He said he was listening to the hunger. What the hell does that even mean? I'd promised her I'd keep an eye on him during our trip, maybe talk some sense into him. Now, I wish I'd just canceled the whole thing. The drive north took us through increasingly desolate country. We'd left Manhattan at dawn, and for the first few hours David seemed almost normal, cracking jokes about our awful boss, complaining about traffic, singing along badly to classic rock on the radio. But as we passed through the smaller towns north of Albany, he grew quieter, more focused. Past Lake Placid, the cell towers disappeared and the forest pressed closer to the road. The trees seemed taller here, older, their trunks scarred by decades of harsh winters. David had stopped talking entirely and was staring out the passenger window with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of anticipation and something that might have been recognition. "You ever been up here before?" I asked, trying to break the increasingly uncomfortable silence. "In dreams," he said softly, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, no, just seen pictures online." But the way he said it made my skin crawl. It was like he was remembering something, not imagining it. By the time we reached the Adirondack Lodge Road, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows through the pine trees. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since Albany, and our breath began to fog when we got out to stretch our legs at a rest stop near Heart Lake. "Look at that," David whispered, pointing toward the high peaks visible in the distance. Mount Marcy rose like a dark tooth against the gray sky, its summit wreathed in clouds that seemed to move against the wind. There was something ominous about the way the mountains loomed over the valley, as if they were watching us approach. "Beautiful," I said, but even as the word left my mouth, it felt wrong. The mountains weren't beautiful, they were hungry. David was nodding slowly, his eyes fixed on the peaks. "Can you feel it?" he asked. "Feel what?" "The pull, like something up there is calling." I couldn't feel anything except the cold and a growing sense of unease. But David stood transfixed for several minutes, his head tilted like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. When he finally got back in the Jeep, there was a strange smile on his face that I'd never seen before. By the time we reached the trailhead at Heart Lake, it was nearly 4 in the afternoon, and thick gray clouds were gathering overhead. The parking lot was almost empty, just a few cars belonging to day hikers who would be heading back soon. The ranger station was closed, its windows dark and unwelcoming. "We should wait until tomorrow," I suggested, eyeing the darkening sky. "It's going to be dark soon, and those clouds look like snow. Plus, we don't have permits for overnight camping." David was already shouldering his massive pack, his eyes bright with that unsettling intensity. "Come on, man. We've got headlamps. Besides, I want to get deep into the woods before we make camp, away from the day hikers and weekend warriors." He gestured toward the few remaining cars in the lot. Away from people. The way he said people made it sound like a dirty word. The Van Hoevenberg Trail started innocuously enough, winding through mixed hardwood forest that was beautiful in the fading daylight. The trail was well maintained and clearly marked, with wooden signs indicating distances to various peaks and landmarks. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a pleasant evening hike. But something felt wrong from the moment we entered the forest. The trees seemed to lean inward over the trail, creating a tunnel effect that blocked out more light than should have been possible. The normal sounds of the forest, birds calling, squirrels chattering, leaves rustling in the breeze, were muted, as if someone had turned down the volume on the entire wilderness. Even stranger was the way our footsteps seemed to echo. On a soft dirt trail, that should have been impossible, but I could hear each step repeated back to us from the dark spaces between the trees. It was like the forest was mocking us, or maybe warning us. David seemed oblivious to these subtle wrongnesses. If anything, he appeared more energetic with each step we took away from civilization. He'd started humming under his breath, not any tune I recognized, just a low, monotonous sound that seemed to harmonize with the unnatural quiet around us. "Dave, what's that song?" I asked after we'd been hiking for about an hour. He stopped humming and looked back at me with confusion. What song? You were humming something. No, I wasn't. But even as he said it, he started up again, that same low, droning melody. After 2 hours of steady climbing, we reached a small clearing about 5 miles in. According to my map, we were roughly halfway to Lake Tier of the Clouds, but the trail markers didn't match what we should have been seeing. The last wooden sign we'd passed had been so weathered the text was illegible, and the trail itself seemed to be changing subtly, sometimes appearing wider than it should be, sometimes narrower, as if it was reshaping itself when we weren't looking directly at it. The clearing offered level ground and some protection from the wind, plus access to a small stream that bubbled up from underground springs. Under normal circumstances, it would have been the perfect campsite. But David insisted we push further. "This is too exposed," he said, standing at the edge of the clearing and staring up at the darkening mountains. "Too visible." "Visible to what?" I asked. "We haven't seen another soul for hours." "That's not what I mean." His voice was distant, distracted. "There are other things that watch in these mountains. Older things." I laughed nervously, trying to break the mood. "Come on, Dave. You sound like one of those ghost story websites you've been reading." But David wasn't joking. He stood motionless for several minutes, his head tilted at an unnatural angle like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Can you hear that?" I strained to listen but heard only the normal sounds of the forest. Wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Hear what? The singing. Something singing in the wind. That's when I realized the forest wasn't making normal sounds at all. The owl call I'd heard came again, but it was too regular, too rhythmic, and there was no wind to speak of, but I could hear something that might have been voices carried on a breeze that didn't exist. "We're setting up camp here," I said firmly, dropping my pack. "It's going to be completely dark soon, and I'm not stumbling around these mountains in the middle of the night." David looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my voice must have convinced him. He helped me set up the tents, but his movements were mechanical, distracted. He kept stopping to stare into the forest, his eyes tracking movement I couldn't see. The first truly strange thing happened while I was trying to get a fire started. I'd brought waterproof matches and plenty of tinder, and the wood we'd gathered seemed dry enough, but the matches kept going out, even when there was no wind. I'd strike one, get it to the tinder, and just as the flames began to catch, they'd flicker and die. After 15 minutes of this, I was getting frustrated and cold. "Must be the altitude," I muttered, though we were nowhere near high enough for that to matter. David was crouched beside me, watching my attempts with an expression that looked almost hungry. "Here, let me try," he said, taking the matches from my hand. When he struck the match, it flared to life with an unnaturally bright flame. The tinder caught immediately, but instead of burning the normal orange-yellow, the flames danced in patterns that didn't make sense. Sometimes blue-white, sometimes an alarming green, sometimes so dark they were almost black. "That's weird," I said, staring at the fire. "Must be minerals in the wood." But David was nodding as if this was exactly what he'd expected. "It's responding," he said quietly. "Responding to what?" "To us being here, to our presence." He fed more wood to the flames, which continued their unnatural color display. "The forest knows we've arrived." I wanted to tell him he was being ridiculous, but something about the way he said it made the words stick in my throat. There was a certainty in his voice that was deeply unsettling. As full darkness fell, the strangeness multiplied. David had pulled out his phone to check our GPS coordinates, and his face went pale as he stared at the screen. "That's impossible," he whispered. "What?" "According to this, we're in the middle of Lake Champlain, underwater." I checked my own phone. Dead battery, even though it had been fully charged when we left the parking lot. "Must be the cold," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. It wasn't nearly cold enough to drain a phone battery that quickly. We managed to heat up some canned soup over the reluctant fire, but the food tasted wrong, metallic and bitter, like it had been contaminated with something. David barely touched his, instead staring intently into the darkness beyond our small circle of firelight. "There's something out there," he said quietly, his voice carrying an odd note of excitement rather than fear. I strained to listen but couldn't pinpoint anything specific. Yet, now that he'd said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by animals. This felt different. More intentional. More intelligent. "It's just wildlife, Dave. We're in their territory." "No." His voice was flat, certain. "Something else. Something that's been waiting." The fire died down to embers despite my efforts to keep it burning. Every time I added wood, the flames would flare briefly, then sink back to almost nothing. It was as if the darkness was actively fighting our light, trying to swallow it. And the darkness itself was wrong. I'd been camping dozens of times, but I'd never experienced blackness this absolute. It was like being trapped in a cave or buried alive. Even with our headlamps, we could barely see more than a few feet in any direction. The beams seemed weak and sickly, struggling against the darkness like it was a physical substance. My chest began to tighten with claustrophobia, even though we were outdoors with an entire sky above us. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating and hostile. I found myself taking shallow, rapid breaths, fighting down a panic attack. "Jesus, it's dark," I whispered, my voice barely audible. David's tent was only 10 feet from mine, but I couldn't see even its outline. "Dave?" I called softly. No response. "Dave, you awake?" Still nothing. The silence was so complete it felt hostile, as if the forest was holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. I fumbled for my headlamp and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing our little camp exactly as we'd left it. David's tent was zipped shut, presumably with him inside. But something was wrong with the light itself. It seemed dimmer than it should be, struggling against the darkness like it was a physical substance. I clicked through the brightness settings, but the beam remained weak and sickly. I tried to sleep, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every few minutes I'd hear a sound, a twig snapping, leaves rustling without wind, what might have been footsteps circling our camp. But when I looked outside, there was nothing. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I was startled awake by the sound of David's tent zipper. I lay perfectly still, listening as footsteps moved around the camp. They paused outside my tent and I held my breath. "Mike!" David's voice, but strangely muffled. "Mike, you awake?" "Yeah," I whispered. "What's wrong?" "I need to check something. Go back to sleep." The footsteps moved away, crackling through the frost-brittle leaves. I waited for the sound of David returning, but it never came. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted back into an uneasy sleep. I woke to complete silence. No birds, no wind, nothing. The absence of sound was so profound it made my ears ring. I checked my watch, 8:47 a.m., but the forest remained wrapped in that unnatural darkness. "Dave!" I called, unzipping my tent. "David!" His tent was empty, sleeping bag unzipped from the inside. His boots were gone, but everything else remained. His pack, his jacket, even his wallet. It was as if he'd simply walked out into the night in his socks. I spent the next hour searching the immediate area, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. The darkness made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction, and my headlamp seemed to grow dimmer with each passing minute. That's when I noticed the tracks. David's bare footprints led away from camp, but they weren't alone. Alongside them were other marks, deeper impressions that might have been made by feet, but wrong somehow, too long, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. Fear settled in my stomach like ice water. I'd heard the stories about the Adirondacks, the old legends the local guides whispered about, things that lived in the deep woods, things that were hungry. I followed the tracks for about 100 yards before they disappeared onto bare rock. By then, the temperature had dropped even further, and ice was forming on the trees. In October, in weather that had been mild just hours before. I made it back to camp and tried to think rationally. David had obviously left for some reason. Maybe he'd gotten sick or had some kind of episode. The smart thing would be to pack up and hike back to the trailhead, get help from the rangers. But as I started breaking down my tent, I heard it. David's voice calling from somewhere deep in the forest. "Mike! Mike! Help me!" The voice was distant but unmistakably his. I grabbed my pack and headlamp and plunged into the woods, following the sound. The darkness seemed to swallow my light completely now, and the trees pressed so close I had to push through them like a physical barrier. "Dave, where are you?" "Over here. I'm hurt." I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face. The voice always seemed to be just ahead, just out of reach. I followed it for what felt like hours, until I was completely lost and my legs were shaking with exhaustion. Then, suddenly, silence. I stood in a small clearing I didn't recognize, gasping and disoriented. My headlamp finally died completely, leaving me in absolute darkness. I fumbled for spare batteries, my hands shaking so badly I could barely open the compartment. When the light flickered back on, David was standing at the edge of the clearing. Relief flooded through me. "Jesus, Dave, I've been looking everywhere for you. Are you okay?" He didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, perfectly still, about 20 feet away. Something about his posture seemed wrong, too rigid. "Dave?" He turned toward me, and that's when I saw his face. It was David, but not David. His features were the same, but his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible surface. His skin was pale, almost gray, and when he smiled I could see that his teeth had become pointed. "I found it, Mike," he said, and his voice was different too, lower, with an echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. There was a wet quality to it, like he was speaking through a mouthful of blood. "I found what was waiting for me in the darkness." I took a step backward, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This thing looked like David, sounded like David, but everything about it was fundamentally wrong. The way it held itself, the way it breathed, even the way it blinked. Too slow, too deliberate, like it was remembering how to be human rather than actually being human. "David, what happened to you? Where have you been?" "I've been learning," he said, taking a step closer. His movements were unnaturally fluid, like he was floating rather than walking. "Learning what it means to be truly hungry, to feed properly, to stop pretending to be something I'm not." The wrongness of him hit me like a physical blow. I'd known David for 8 years, and this thing wearing his face was like a photograph that had been slightly altered, recognizable but fundamentally changed in ways that made my brain recoil. "You don't remember, do you?" I said, backing away slowly, trying to keep the distance between us. "You don't remember, Sarah. You don't remember our trip to Colorado last summer, or the time we got lost hiking in Vermont." Something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe even pain. For a moment he looked like my friend again, lost and frightened. "I remember," he started, then shook his head violently as if trying to dislodge something from inside his skull. "No. That was before I understood what I really was, what I was always meant to be." "Before you understood what?" His smile widened impossibly, stretching his face in ways that human anatomy shouldn't allow. "That I was starving my entire life and didn't even know it. That we're all starving, Mike, every single one of us, but we're too weak and stupid to acknowledge what we really need." "What do you need, David?" "To feed," he said simply. "To consume. To take what others have and make it mine." His black eyes fixed on me with predatory intensity. "Starting with you." I saw then that his fingernails had grown into claws, yellowed and curved like those of some giant bird of prey. Dark stains covered the front of his shirt, stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "David, this isn't you," I said desperately. "You're sick. Something's happened to you. Something's taken control. Fight it." For a moment he hesitated, and I saw David, the real David, flicker behind those black eyes. But then the moment passed, and the thing wearing his face laughed. David was weak, it said. David was afraid of his own hunger, afraid of what he really wanted. I've set him free. That's when I ran. The forest had become a nightmare maze of twisted branches and hidden roots. I crashed through the underbrush, my headlamp beam dancing wildly as I fled. Behind me, I could hear the thing that had been David following. Not running, but moving with an inhuman efficiency that somehow kept pace with my panicked sprint. "You can't run forever, Mike," his voice called through the darkness, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "These woods are mine now. This is my territory, and you're trespassing." I stumbled and fell, rolling down a steep slope and slamming into a tree trunk hard enough to see stars. Pain shot through my ribs and I tasted blood. When I looked up, David was standing at the top of the slope, silhouetted against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, and for a moment he sounded like himself again. "But I'm so hungry, Mike, so fucking hungry, and you're the only food around." I scrambled to my feet and kept running, no longer caring about direction or destination. All I knew was that the thing wearing my friend's face was behind me, and it wanted to feed. The chase continued for what felt like hours. Sometimes I would gain ground, hiding behind trees or in small ravines, but David always found me. He seemed to know exactly where I was, as if he could smell my fear or hear my heartbeat from impossible distances. "Remember when we were kids?" His voice drifted through the trees as I crouched behind a fallen log trying to catch my breath. "Remember that camping trip with your dad when we were 12? How we got lost for 3 hours in those woods behind your house?" The memory hit me like a punch to the gut. We had gotten lost, and David had been terrified, crying and begging to go home. I'd been the one to calm him down, to help him remember the way back to my dad's camp. "Your dad made us s'mores that night," the voice continued, closer now. "Said we were brave little explorers. But I wasn't brave, was I, Mike? I was just pretending. I was always pretending to be braver than I really was." "Stop it," I whispered, tears freezing on my cheeks. "But I'm not pretending anymore." The voice was right behind me now. I'm finally being honest about what I am. I bolted from my hiding place, crashing through a stand of young pines. Branches whipped at my face and I could feel blood running down my cheeks, but I didn't dare slow down. The forest seemed to go on forever, an endless labyrinth of darkness and twisted trees. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, and my headlamp was growing dimmer with each passing minute. I was running on pure adrenaline now, but I could feel that starting to fade too. Eventually, I found myself at the edge of a frozen lake I didn't recognize. The ice stretched out into the darkness and I could hear it creaking ominously under its own weight. According to my mental map, there shouldn't have been any lakes this size in the area where we'd been camping, but then again, nothing about this night had made sense. Behind me, David's footsteps were getting closer and I could hear him humming that same monotonous tune from earlier. But now, I recognized it. It wasn't a song at all. It was the sound of something large, breathing slowly and deliberately. I had nowhere left to run. I turned to face him as he emerged from the tree line. In the dim starlight reflecting off the ice, I could see him more clearly now. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, and there was something wrong with the proportions of his body. His arms seemed too long, his fingers too thin. His neck stretched in a way that suggested his spine had somehow been elongated. But it was still recognizably David, which somehow made it worse. "It doesn't have to hurt," he said, taking slow, measured steps onto the ice. The surface held his weight easily, as if he'd become lighter somehow. I remember enough about friendship to make it quick. "What are you?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm what this place makes you become if you're strong enough to accept it," he said. "What it's been trying to make everyone become for centuries. The hunger is older than the mountains, Mike. Older than the trees. It's been waiting here since before humans walked upright, patient and persistent. calling to anyone who might be ready to embrace their true nature. He was close enough now that I could see the details of his transformation more clearly. His skin had a waxy, translucent quality, and dark veins were visible beneath the surface like some kind of subcutaneous root system. His eyes weren't just black. They were empty, like looking into deep water at night. "David's still in there somewhere," I said desperately. "I know he is. Fight it." "David was already starving when he got here," the thing said. "Starving for purpose, for meaning, for something real. His job, his relationships, his whole life. It was all just pretending to be satisfied when he was dying inside. I didn't take him, Mike. I liberated him." It lunged at me then, moving faster than anything human should be able to move. I dove sideways, rolling across the ice as claws raked the air where I'd been standing. The surface cracked under our combined weight, spiderweb fractures spreading outward from where we'd landed. The creature that had been David snarled in frustration and came at me again, but this time I was ready. I pulled out my camping knife, a pathetic weapon against what I was facing, but all I had. When it lunged, I managed to rake the blade across its arm. Black blood sprayed across the ice, steaming in the cold air. The creature shrieked in pain and rage, a sound like breaking glass mixed with a dying animal's scream. But even as I watched, the wound was already beginning to heal, the flesh knitting itself back together like time-lapse footage of plant growth. "You can't kill me, Mike," it said, circling me like a predator. "I'm already dead." David died the moment he stepped into the darkness and heard the call. "Then why do you still remember him?" I demanded, trying to buy time while I looked for another weapon or an escape route. The creature paused, and for just a moment, I saw confusion flicker across its features. "Because," it started, then shook its head. "Because the hunger needs memory, needs to understand what it's consuming in order to use it properly." I saw my chance and took it. While the creature was distracted by its internal struggle, I charged forward and drove my knife deep into its chest. Not trying to kill it, I knew that was impossible, but aiming for the place where David's heart would be. The creature screamed again, but this time the sound was different, more human, more anguished. Instead of the black ichor I'd expected, real blood began to flow from the wound. Red, human blood. "Remember Sarah," I whispered, pressing the knife deeper. "Remember how much you loved her. Remember the way she laughed at your stupid jokes. Remember who you used to be." I can't." The voice was David's again, confused and frightened. "Mike, what's happening to me? I can't remember. There's something inside my head, something that won't let me think clearly." "Fight it," I said urgently. "You're stronger than this thing. You always were." For a moment, David's eyes cleared, returning to their normal brown. He looked down at the knife in his chest, then back at me with an expression of pure horror. "Mike," he whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. It showed me things, promised me things. I thought I wanted them, but now I can't remember why." His face was changing, becoming more human again. The waxy pallor was fading and his features were shifting back to their normal proportions. "It's okay," I said. "We're going to get you help. We're going to figure this out." But even as I spoke, I could see the darkness returning to his eyes. "He's gone," the creature snarled, grabbing my wrist with inhuman strength. "And now you join him." But the distraction had given me what I needed. I twisted the knife and pulled it free, then drove it upward into the creature's throat. It staggered backward, clutching at the wound, and I ran. The ice held just long enough for me to reach the opposite shore. Behind me, I heard it crack and give way, followed by a splash and a scream that might have been rage or might have been David calling my name one last time. I didn't look back. The next 12 hours were a blur of stumbling through the darkness, following what I hoped was the trail back to civilization. My headlamp finally died completely, leaving me to navigate by feel and instinct. I fell countless times, cutting my hands and face on hidden rocks and branches, but I kept moving. Sometime around dawn, the unnatural darkness finally began to lift, and I found myself on a familiar section of the Van Hoevenberg Trail. I'd somehow made it back to within 3 miles of the trailhead, though I had no memory of covering that much ground. The rangers found me staggering down the trail like a zombie, hypothermic and delirious. They said I'd been missing for 5 days, though I could have sworn it was only 2 nights. My story about David falling through ice and drowning was accepted without question. Tragic accidents happened in the wilderness all the time. They searched for David for weeks, using helicopters, search dogs, and volunteer teams. They dragged the few lakes in the area, checked every trail and campsite, even brought in specialized equipment to search underwater caves. But they never found any trace of him. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead due to exposure and drowning. I never told them what really happened. Who would believe me? But I know David's still out there, somewhere in the deep woods around Mount Marcy, changed, hungry, waiting for the next group of hikers to wander too far from the trail. The text messages started about a month after I got back to the city. They came from David's old number, always in the middle of the night, always the same message. I'm still hungry, Mike. So very hungry. I've changed my number 4 times, but the messages keep coming. Somehow, it always finds me. Last week, I got a call from Sarah, David's ex-girlfriend. She wanted to know if I'd heard from him lately. Apparently, he'd been calling her too, leaving voicemails in the middle of the night. She played one for me over the phone, her voice shaking. It was David's voice, but wrong somehow. Too low, with that strange echo I remembered from the forest. Sarah, the recording said, I remember you now. I remember how much I loved you, how much I wanted to share everything with you. I still want that. Come find me in the mountains. Come feed with me. We can be hungry together. Sarah hung up without saying goodbye. I haven't slept properly since then. Every shadow looks like David's silhouette. Every unexpected sound makes me jump. I've tried therapy, medication, even considered checking myself into a psychiatric facility. But nothing helps, because I know the truth. Some hungers can never be satisfied, and some friends never really leave you no matter how much you wish they would. The creature in the Adirondacks is still waiting, still feeding, still learning. And it's learned to use technology now. Phones, social media, email. It's adapting, evolving, finding new ways to call people into the darkness. Last night I got a new message. Not from David's number this time, but from an unknown contact. Come back to the mountains, Mike. I've been waiting for you. I have so much to show you, so much to teach you about hunger. Attached was a photo of our old campsite, exactly as we'd left it 3 months ago. Our tents were still there, perfectly preserved, as if time had stopped the moment David walked into the darkness. But there was something else in the photo. Standing just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the shadows between the trees, was a figure I recognized. David. Or what David had become. He was smiling that impossible smile, his black eyes reflecting the camera flash like those of a nocturnal predator. And written in the frost on his tent was a message. Miss me yet?